Bedtime Reading. Little Women. Chapter 1. Christmas Gifts.
Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents,
complained Joe. It's so terrible to be poor, cried Meg, looking down at her old dress.
I don't think it's fair for some girls to have pretty things, while other girls nothing at all,
added little Amy. We've got Father and Mother and each other, said Beth, sounding content.
But we haven't got Father. He's still away fighting in the war, and he won't be home for a long time,
said Joe sadly. Nobody spoke for a minute, each thinking of their father far away where the fighting was. Then Meg spoke with more cheerfulness. You know the reason why Mother suggested we not have any presents this Christmas was that it is going to be a difficult winter for everyone, and we shouldn't spend money for pleasure when our men are suffering in the army.
But Mother gave us each $1 to spend to ourselves. I don't think the army would be much helped by our giving that. I agreed not to expect any presents from Mother or you, but I do want to buy a few books I've been wishing for. Mother didn't say anything about our money, and she won't wish us to give up everything. Let's each buy what we want and have a little fun. I'm sure we work hard enough to earn it,
cried Joe. I know I do, teaching those tiresome children all day, while I'm thinking of enjoying myself, began Meg.
You don't have such a hard time as I do,
said Joe.
How would you like to be forced to remain with a nervous, angry old lady who is never satisfied with anything?
I do think that washing dishes and keeping things clean is the worst work in the world. It upsets me and hurts my hands, so I can't play my piano well at all, complained Beth.
I don't believe any of you suffer as I do,
cried Amy.
For you don't have to go to school with rude girls who laugh at your dresses and call you poor because your father isn't rich like theirs.
Oh, don't you wish we had the money Papa lost when we were little, Joe? How happy and good we'd be if we had no worries, exclaimed Meg, who could remember better times. You said the other day you thought we were a great deal happier than many of our rich neighbors' children, who are always fighting with one another, responded Beth. Yes, I did, Beth. Well, I think we are, though we do have to work. We are cheerful about it. As young readers like to know how people look, we will take this moment to give them a little picture of the 4 sisters who sat together by the fire, while the December snow fell quietly outside. It was a comfortable old room, though the furniture was very plain. A few good pictures hung on the walls and books filled the shelves. Margaret, the eldest of the 4, was 16 and very pretty, being fair with large eyes and soft brown hair. 15-year-old Joe was very tall, thin, and brown. She had sharp gray eyes, which appeared to see everything. Her long, thick hair was her one beauty, but it was usually tied back to be out of her way. Joe also had the uncomfortable appearance of a girl who was rapidly approaching womanhood and didn't like it. Elizabeth, or Beth, as everyone called her, was a shy, peaceful girl of 13, with smooth hair and bright eyes. Sweet Beth seemed to live happily in a world of her own. Amy, though the youngest, was the most important person, in her own opinion. Amy's blonde, curly hair fell on her pale shoulders, which were always upright and ladylike, as she desired to have the excellent manners of a young lady. As the girls sat near the fire, Jo saw her mother's slippers sitting nearby, and picked them up to examine them.
They are quite worn out. Marmee must have a new pair.
I thought I'd get her some with my $1, said Beth.
No, I shall,
cried Amy. I'm the oldest, began Meg, but Jo interrupted with,
I'm the man of the family now Papa is away, and I shall buy the slippers, for he told me to take special care of Mother while he was gone.
I'll tell you what we'll do, said Beth. Let's each get her something for Christmas, and not get anything for ourselves.
That's like you, dear. What will we get?
Exclaimed Jo. Everyone thought quietly for a moment before Meg announced, I shall give her a nice pair of gloves, as she delighted at the sight of her own pale hands.
I'll get her a pair of army shoes, the best there are,
cried Jo. Some handkerchiefs, said Beth.
I'll get a little bottle of perfume. She likes it, and it won't cost much, so I'll have some left to buy pencils for drawing,
added Amy. How will we give the things? Asked Meg.
We'll put them on the table and bring her in and see her open each gift. Don't you remember how we used to do that on our birthdays?
Answered Jo. I used to be so frightened when it was my turn to sit in the big chair and see you all come around me to give me the presents with a kiss. I liked the things and the kisses, but it was terrible to have you sit looking at me while I opened the presents, said Beth.
Marmee will think we are getting things for ourselves, and then we'll surprise her. We must go shopping tomorrow afternoon, Meg. There is so much to do about the play for Christmas night,
said Jo, walking up and down the stairs with her hands behind her back. I don't plan to act in any more plays after this one. I'm getting too old for such things, observed Meg, who still secretly delighted in dressing up and acting.
You won't stop, I know, as long as you can walk around in a white dress. You are the best actress we've got, and there'll be an end to everything if you quit, said Jo. We should practice our roles for the play tonight. There is still much work to be done before the Christmas play.
I don't understand how you can write and act such wonderful things, Jo. You're a regular Shakespeare, exclaimed Beth, who strongly believed her sisters were gifted with extraordinary talents.
Not quite,
replied Jo modestly.
Though I do think this play is a rather nice thing. Hello, my dear girls,
said a cheery voice at the door, and the girls turned to welcome a tall, motherly lady with a "Can I help you?" look about her, which was truly delightful. She was not elegantly dressed, but she was certainly a noble-looking woman, and the girls believed the unfashionable clothing covered the most splendid mother in the world.
Well, my dears, how have you been today? Has anyone come today, Beth? How is your cold, Meg? Jo, you look tired. Come and kiss me, little Amy.
While Mrs. March took off her coat and shoes, the girls ran about, trying to make things comfortable for their mother. Meg arranged the tea table, Jo brought wood for the fire, and Beth walked around the kitchen, quiet and busy, while Amy gave directions to everyone as she sat at the table. As they gathered around the table, Mrs. March said, with a particularly happy face,
"I've got a treat for you after dinner."
The girls looked delighted. knowing that a letter had arrived from their father.
"A letter! A letter from Father!"
cried the girls.
"Yes, a nice long letter. He is well, and thinks he shall be healthy throughout the winter. He sends loving wishes for Christmas, and a special message to you girls,"
said Mrs. March cheerfully.
"Let's hurry and eat, so Mother will read us the letter,"
exclaimed Joe. "I think it was so splendid that Father joined the army as a minister, though he was too old to go as a soldier," said Meg warmly.
"I wish I could go as a drummer or a nurse, so I could be near him and help him,"
exclaimed Joe.
"It must be very disagreeable to sleep outside and eat bad-tasting things,"
said Amy. "When will he come home, Marmee?" asked Beth quietly.
"Not for many months, dear, unless he is sick. He will stay and do his work as long as he can. Now, come and hear the letter."
They all went to the fire to listen. In most letters Father sent home to their families, little was said of their suffering, the dangers faced, or the homesick feelings they felt while away in the war. Most were cheerful, hopeful letters, full of descriptions of military life and news. In the end of this father's letter, he wrote of his fatherly love and longing for the little girls at home.
"Give them all my dear love and a kiss. Tell them I think of them all day and dream of them at night. A year seems very long to wait before I see them, but remind them that while we wait, we may all work, so that these hard days are not wasted. I know they will remember all I said to them, that they will be loving children to you, and I will be fonder and prouder than ever of my little women."
Everyone was weeping when Mrs. March read that last part. Joe wasn't ashamed to be seen crying, and Amy hid her face on her mother's shoulder, crying,
"I am a selfish girl, but I'll truly try to be better, so he won't be disappointed in me."
"We all will," cried Meg. "I think too much of my looks and hate to work, but I'll certainly try not to anymore."
"I'll try to be a little woman, as he loves to call me, and not be wild. I'll do my duty here, instead of wanting to be somewhere else,"
said Joe. Beth said nothing, but picked up her sewing and began her duty, promising, in her quiet little soul, to be all that Father hoped her to be.
"Now, each of you has explained how you will make your father proud during the coming year, except Beth," said their mother.
"Yes, I have. I will try to enjoy doing dishes and cleaning, not envy girls with nice pianos, and try not to be afraid of people." Everyone wanted to laugh at what she said, but no one did, as it would hurt her feelings very much. At 9, they stopped their work and sang as usual before they went to bed. No one but Beth could play the old piano well, and she managed to make pleasant music while the others sang. Meg had a beautiful voice, and she and her mother led the others in the singing. Amy's baby voice could be heard at times, while Jo sang as she pleased, always with the wrong sound that ruined the most beautiful songs. The first sound in the morning was their mother's voice as she went about the house, and the last sound at night was the same cheery sound, as the girls never grew tired of their mother's voice. Chapter 2. A Merry Christmas. Jo was the first to wake up on Christmas morning. No presents were next to the fireplace, and for a moment she felt disappointed, as she remembered long ago when she would awake to find presents filling the sitting room. Then she remembered her mother's promise and went to wake her sisters. "Where is Mother?" asked Meg, as she and Joe ran down the stairs. "Some poor child came here begging for your mother's help, and she went right away to see what the child needed. I have never met another woman so generous," replied Hannah, who had lived with the family since Meg was born, and was considered by them all more as a friend than a servant. "She will be back soon, so let's finish getting breakfast ready," said Meg.
"Now there's Mother coming. Hide the gifts, quick!"
cried Joe as the door opened.
"Merry Christmas, Marmee!"
they cried together.
"Merry Christmas, little daughters. Now, I want to ask you something before we sit down for breakfast. Not far away from here lies a poor woman with a newborn baby. 6 children are freezing together in one bed, for they have no fire. There is nothing to eat over there, and the oldest boy came to tell me they were suffering from hunger and cold. My girls, will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present?"
They were all quite hungry, and for a minute no one spoke. But Joe soon exclaimed,
"I'm glad you came before we began eating." "I thought you'd do it,"
said Mrs. March, smiling with satisfaction.
"We shall all go, and when we come back, we will have bread and milk for breakfast."
They were soon ready, and began their walk to see the sick woman and her children. A poor, miserable room it was, with broken windows, no fire, a sick mother, crying baby, and a group of pale, hungry children crowded together to keep warm. Hannah brought wood for the fireplace, while Mrs. March gave the mother tea and porridge, and comforted her with promises of help, while she dressed the baby tenderly. The girls prepared the table and set the children near the fire, feeding them, laughing and talking. That was a happy breakfast, though they didn't eat any of it. When they went away, leaving comfort behind, they were the merriest of girls, and were quite content to eat bread and milk on Christmas morning. After returning home, the girls prepared their presents for their mother. Mrs. March was both surprised and touched at receiving the gifts. The slippers went on her feet immediately. A new handkerchief was put in her pocket, and scented with Amy's perfume that came in a fancy bottle she purchased instead of the pencils she had planned to buy for herself. The morning events took so much time that the rest of the day was spent preparing for the evening play, as the family was not wealthy enough to afford going to the theater. On Christmas night, 12 neighbor girls sat on one of the family beds to watch the performance. The guests watched in wonder, sometimes laughing, crying, or looking astonished at the events in the story. At the close of the performance, they cheered and clapped eagerly. Soon after, Hannah came in to announce that dinner was ready. This extraordinary meal was a surprise to all, and when they saw the table, they looked at each other in amazement. It was not surprising that Marmee would find a way to surprise the girls with a treat, but such a fine meal as this was never had since the start of the war. There was ice cream, cake, fruit, chocolates, and in the middle of the table were flowers. They stared at the table in wonder before turning to their mother, looking pleased.
"Our neighbor, old Mr. Lawrence, sent this to us,"
Mrs. March began. "The Lawrence boy's grandfather. I don't know what made him think of doing such a thing. We don't know him," exclaimed Meg.
"Hannah told one of his servants about your breakfast party. He is an odd old gentleman, but that pleased him. He knew my father years ago, and he sent me a polite note this afternoon saying he hoped I would allow him to send you all a little present.
His grandson told him to do it. I know he did. He's such a wonderful young man. I wish we could know him better. He looks as if he'd like to know us, but he's shy.
I like his manners, and he looks like a little gentleman, so I would certainly like to know him better,
declared Amy. Yes, we'll have another play sometime that he can come see. Perhaps he'll help act. Wouldn't that be wonderful? How pretty these flowers are, exclaimed Meg, as she began examining them with great interest.
They are lovely,
returned their mother. I wish I could send some to Father. I'm afraid he isn't having such a merry Christmas as we are, said Beth quietly. Chapter 3. The Lawrence Boy. Joe! Joe! Where are you? cried Meg at the bottom of the stairs.
Here,
answered her sister from above. Meg found her eating apples and crying over the latest novel she was reading. Such fun! You and I have received an invitation from Mrs. Gardner for a dance she's having tomorrow night to celebrate New Year's Eve. Oh, now what shall we wear? Cried Meg.
Your dress looks new, but I forgot the burn and tear in mine. What shall I do? The burn shows badly.
You must sit still to make sure no one sees the back of your dress, instructed Meg. As they walked along to the dance the next evening, both felt a bit anxious, as they seldom went to parties. Though this gathering was rather informal, it was an event to them. Upon arriving, Meg immediately went off with a few of the older girls, whispering and laughing as she went. Jo, however, did not care much for girls and remained away from the crowd, with her back carefully against the wall. No one came to talk to her, and soon she was left alone. She could not walk around and amuse herself, as the burn on her dress would show. When the dancing began, Meg was asked immediately. Jo saw a young man approaching her, and fearing he meant to ask her to dance, she went to hide in a dark room nearby, hoping to enjoy herself quietly. Unfortunately, another shy person had gone there as well, and she soon discovered the Lawrence boy hiding.
I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here,
she exclaimed in embarrassment.
Please, stay if you'd like,
he said with a laugh.
I won't disturb you?
Not a bit. I only came here because I don't know many people, and felt rather strange at first.
So did I.
I think I've seen you before, haven't I? You are a neighbor of Grandpa's,
said the boy, sitting down near Jo.
Yes, we did have such a good time over your nice Christmas present.
Grandpa sent it, Miss March.
But you gave him the idea, didn't you, now? And I am not Miss March. I'm only Jo.
I'm not Mr. Lawrence. I'm only Laurie.
Laurie Lawrence. What an odd name.
My first name is Theodore, but I don't like it. So I make people call me Laurie instead.
I hate my name, too. I wish everyone would say Jo instead of Josephine.
Don't you like to dance, Miss Jo?
asked Laurie.
I like to when there aren't too many people. Don't you dance?
Sometimes I've been abroad for many years, and don't know how the dancing is done here.
Abroad?
cried Jo.
Oh, tell me about it. I love to hear people describe their travels.
Laurie then told her about his days in Switzerland schools and travels around France, Italy, and Germany, among other places. The two chatted till they felt like old friends. Joe liked the Lawrence boy more than ever and took several good looks at him, so she could describe him to the girls, for they had no brothers, and boys were almost unknown to the young girls.
I suppose you are going to college soon?
Joe asked, feeling quite a bit more comfortable with the boy now.
No, not for a year or two. I won't go before 17 anyway.
Aren't you 15?
Asked Joe, looking at the tall boy, whom she had thought to be 17 already.
16 next month.
I wish I was going to college. You don't seem as if you would like going to college.
I know I'll hate it. Nothing but studying. And I don't like the boys in this country.
That's a splendid song. Why don't you go and dance?
Joe asked, changing the subject.
If you will come too,
he answered with a smile.
I can't. I told Meg I wouldn't because...
Because what?
Asked Laurie curiously.
You won't tell?
Never.
Well, I like standing by the fire, and so I sometimes burn my dresses. This one has a terrible burn on the back side, and though it's been nicely mended, the burn still shows. And Meg told me to stay near the wall so no one sees it. You may laugh if you want to. It is funny, I know.
But Laurie didn't laugh and spoke very gently.
Never mind that. There's a long hall out there where we can dance, and no one will see us. Please come.
Joe thanked him and gladly went. The hall was empty, and both were delighted with the others dancing. When the music stopped, they sat down on the stairs to rest when Joe heard Meg calling for her. Joe found her in one of the side rooms, sitting on the sofa, holding her foot. I've hurt my foot dancing. It aches terribly, and I can hardly stand. I don't know how I'm ever going to get home, she said, looking pale with pain.
I knew you'd hurt your feet with those silly shoes. I'm sorry, but I don't know what else we can do besides rent a carriage or stay here all night,
answered Joe. I can't stay here, for the house is full. Sally has some girls staying with her, and renting a carriage would be quite expensive. I'll rest till Hannah comes, and then I'll try to walk.
I'll ask Laurie. He will go,
said Joe. Dear, no. Don't ask or tell anyone. Now watch for Hannah and tell me the minute she comes.
The other guests are going to dinner now. I'll stay with you. I'd rather.
No, dear. Bring me some coffee. I'm awfully tired. So Meg waited on the sofa, and Joe went to the dining room.
Can I help you?
Said a friendly voice. And there was Laurie, with a full cup of coffee in his hand.
I was trying to get something for Meg, who is very tired.
I was looking for someone to give this to. May I take it to your sister?
Oh, thank you. I'll show you where she is.
As if used to waiting on ladies, Laurie brought up a little table and soon went for another cup of coffee for Joe, and was so polite that Meg soon declared him to be a nice boy. They had a wonderful time drinking coffee and eating candies before Hannah arrived to take them home. Meg forgot her foot and began to stand up, but fell to the floor with a cry of pain. Don't say anything, she whispered to her sister. It's nothing. I turned my foot a little, that's all, she explained to Hannah as she went upstairs to fetch her things. While Meg was upstairs crying in pain, Joe decided she must help and ran downstairs to find Laurie. She explained her situation, and Laurie immediately offered his grandfather's carriage. Jo gratefully accepted the offer and returned to her sister to deliver the news.
I had a wonderful time. Did you?
Asked Jo after their return home. Yes, till I hurt myself. Sally's friend Annie Moffat was quite fond of me and asked me to come and spend a week with her when Sally does. She is going in the spring, and it will be splendid if Mother lets me go, answered Meg cheerfully.
I don't believe fine young ladies enjoy themselves a bit more than we do, though we have no carriages of our own or fancy dresses.
And I think Jo was quite right. Chapter 4. Responsibilities. Oh dear, how hard it is to take up our duties again after such a wonderful party, Meg said sadly the next morning, as the holidays were now over, and she would have to return to work.
I wish it was Christmas or New Year's all the time. Wouldn't it be fun?
Answered Jo. It would seem nice to have little dinners and parties and not work. It's like other people, you know, and I always envy girls who do such things. I'm so fond of wealth and comfort, said Meg.
Well, we can't have it, so let's not complain, but try to be cheerful about our work, as Marmee does.
So the girls went down to breakfast, to find everyone rather upset. Beth had a headache. Amy was worried because she had not learned her lessons. Mrs. March was very busy trying to finish a letter, and Hannah was not cheerful, for being up late didn't suit her.
There never was such an angry family,
cried Jo, when she discovered that she had sat on her hat.
You're the angriest person in it,
returned Amy.
Girls, do be quiet. I must finish this letter,
cried Mrs. March.
Hold your cats to comfort yourself, Bethy. Goodbye, Marmee. We certainly are upset this morning, but we'll come home regular angels. Let's go, Meg,
exclaimed Jo as she prepared to leave. They always looked back before turning the corner, for their mother was always at the window to smile and wave to them. It seemed as if they couldn't have got through the day without seeing that smile from their mother. When Mr. March lost his land in trying to help an unfortunate friend, the two oldest girls begged to be allowed to do a little work. Their parents agreed, pleased that their girls wished to have independence. Margaret found a place as a governess, caring for a nearby family's children every morning. She felt rich with her small salary, and as she was fond of wealth and comfort, her main problem was poverty. She found it more difficult than the other girls to bear her family's lack of wealth because she could remember a time when their home was beautiful and life was full of pleasure and comfort. She tried not to envy her friends, but she still longed for pretty things and a comfortable life. Jo happened to suit Aunt March, who was getting older and needed someone younger to wait on her. The childless old lady had offered to take in one of the girls when the family's troubles began, and was quite offended because her offer was declined. But Mr. and Mrs. March only explained,
We can't give up our girls for a dozen of fortunes. Rich or poor, we will stay together and be happy.
The old lady wouldn't speak to them for quite some time, but happened to meet Jo at a friend's. She seemed quite charmed with Jo's honest manner and proposed to hire her. This did not suit Jo at all, but she accepted the position since nothing better appeared, and, to everyone's surprise, she got along quite well with the angry old woman. The real attraction, rather, was the large library of fine books. The minute Aunt March lay down to rest or was busy with company, Jo hurried to this quiet place to read. But, like all happiness, it did not last long. As soon as she had reached the heart of the story, she would hear, "Josephine! Josephine!" And she had to leave her precious book to return to her aunt. Beth was too shy to go to school. She had tried, but suffered so much that it was given up, and she did her lessons at home with her father. After her father went to fight in the war, she continued faithfully by herself and did the best she could. She enjoyed staying home and helped Hannah keep the home clean and comfortable for the workers, never thinking of any reward but to be loved. Long, quiet days she spent busy with her dolls and kittens, never lonely nor lazy. Beth did have troubles as well as the others, particularly because she couldn't take music lessons and have a fine piano. She loved music so dearly, tried hard to learn, and practiced so patiently at the family's old instrument, that it did seem as if someone, not to hint Aunt March, should help her. She sang while doing her work, and was never too tired to play the old instrument for Marmee and the girls, and day after day said hopefully to herself, "I know I'll get my music sometime, if I'm good." The little artist, as her sisters called her, had a talent for drawing, and was always drawing in her spare time. Amy's teachers complained that instead of paying attention in class, she was found drawing animals or flowers. She was quite popular among her friends, being happy and pleasing. Amy was rather spoiled, being the youngest child, and little Amy was certainly the most selfish of the 4 girls. Amy told all her secrets to Meg, and by some strange attraction, gentle Beth told Jo hers. The 2 older girls were still quite close, but each took one of the younger ones to watch over, playing mother, as they called it. Chapter 5. Being Neighborly. One morning, Jo went outside to make a path for Beth to walk through the snow. As she did her work, she looked over to the Lawrence home, hoping to see the Lawrence boy again. Since the party, she had been more eager than ever, and had planned many ways of making friends with him, but he had not been seen lately, and Jo began to think he had gone away. As she examined the lonely-looking home, she spotted the boy looking out sadly from an upstairs window.
"There he is,"
thought Jo.
"Poor boy, all alone and sick today. It's a shame."
The boy's head turned, and he looked down with a great smile at Jo.
"How are you? Are you sick?"
asked Jo. Laurie opened the window, saying,
"Better, thank you. I've had a bad cold and was not allowed to leave the house this week."
"I'm sorry. What do you amuse yourself with?"
"Nothing. It's dull and boring here."
"Don't you read?"
"Not much. They won't let me."
"Can't someone read to you?"
"Grandpa does sometimes, but my books don't interest him. And I hate to ask Brooke, my tutor, to read to me all the time."
"Have someone come and see you then."
"There isn't anyone I'd like to see. Boys are so wild, and I'm too weak."
"Isn't there some nice girl who'd read and amuse you? Girls are quiet."
"Don't know any."
"You know us,"
began Jo.
"So I do. Will you come, please?"
cried Laurie.
"I'm not quiet and nice, but I'll come if Mother lets me. I'll go ask her. Shut that window like a good boy, and wait till I come."
Jo then marched into the house to speak to her mother. Laurie was quite excited at the idea of having company, and ran around his room to clean. Mrs. March said he was a little gentleman, and gave her daughter permission to go visit. Soon after, the servants at the Lawrence home were surprised to find a young girl asking for Mr. Lorry.
"Here I am,"
she said cheerfully, walking into his room.
"Mother sent her love and hopes you feel better. Meg wanted me to bring some of the dessert she made to you, and Beth thought her cats would be comforting, so I've brought them along too. I knew you'd laugh at them, but I couldn't refuse. She was so anxious to do something."
Lorry, however, was delighted at having the kittens to play with.
How kind you are! Now, please sit down and let me amuse you.
"No, I came to amuse you. Shall I read aloud?"
And Joe looked longingly at the bookshelf nearby.
Thank you, I've read all those, but if you don't mind, I'd rather talk,
answered Lorry.
"Not a bit. I'll talk all day if you'd like. Beth says I never know when to stop."
Is Beth the one with pink cheeks, who stays at home usually?
Asked Lorry with interest.
"Yes, that's Beth. She's my girl."
The pretty one is Meg, and the curly-haired one is Amy, I believe.
"How did you find that out?"
Lorry looked embarrassed, but answered,
I often hear you calling to one another, and when I'm alone up here, I often look over at your house. You always seem to be having such a good time. I'm sorry for being so rude, but sometimes you forget to close the curtains, and when the lights are on, it's like looking at a picture, with you all around the table with your mother. I don't have any mother, you know.
"Well, we'll never close the curtains anymore, and you may look as much as you like. I just wish, though, instead of watching, you'd come over and see us. Mother is so splendid, and Beth would sing to you, and Amy would dance. Meg and I would make you laugh, and we'd have a wonderful time. Wouldn't your grandpa let you?"
I think he would if your mother asked him. He's very kind, though he does not look so. He lets me do what I like, as long as I don't bother strangers,
began Lorry.
"We are not strangers. We are neighbors, and you shouldn't think you'd be a bother. We want to know you, and I've been trying to get to know you for so long. We haven't lived here for too long, you know, but still know all our neighbors but you."
You see, Grandpa doesn't mind much what happens outside. Mr. Brooke, my tutor, doesn't stay here, and I have no one to go about with me, so I usually just stay at home.
"That's bad. You should go out visiting everywhere you are asked. Then you'll have many friends and pleasant places to go to. Don't worry about being shy. It won't last long if you keep trying."
Then they got to talking about books, and to Joe's delight, she found that Lorry loved them as well as she did, and had read even more than herself.
If you love them so much, come down and see ours. Grandpa is out, so don't be afraid,
said Lorry.
"I'm not afraid of anything,"
returned Joe. Joe was amazed with the books, furniture, and paintings, and looked about her with satisfaction.
"Theodore Lawrence, you should be the happiest boy in the world,"
she exclaimed.
A boy can't live on books,
said Lorry. Suddenly, a bell rang, and a servant came into the room.
"Dear me, it's your grandpa,"
exclaimed Joe.
Well, what if it is? You are not afraid of anything, you know,
returned the boy.
"I think I am a little bit afraid of him, but I don't know why I should be. Marmee says he is quite a wonderful man."
"The doctor is here to see you, sir," said the servant after a moment.
Would you mind if I left you for a minute? I suppose I must go see the doctor,
said Lorry.
Don't mind me. I'm quite happy here with all these books,"
answered Joe. Laurie went away, and his guest amused herself in her own way. She was standing in front of a painting of old Mr. Lawrence when the door was opened again, and without turning she said,
"I'm sure now that I shouldn't be afraid of him, for he's got kind eyes. He isn't as handsome as my grandfather, but I like him."
"Thank you, miss,"
said an old voice behind her, and there stood old Mr. Lawrence. Joe was speechless with embarrassment, but she decided she would not run away.
"So you're not afraid of me?"
asked the old man.
"Not much, sir."
"And you don't think me as handsome as your grandfather?"
"Not quite, sir."
"But you like me still?"
"Yes, I do, sir."
That answer pleased the old gentleman. He gave a short laugh and shook hands with her, saying,
"You've certainly got your grandfather's spirit. He was a fine man. But what is better, he was also brave and honest, and I was proud to be his friend."
"Thank you, sir."
And Joe was quite comfortable after that, for it suited her exactly.
"Now,"
said the old man,
"won't you have tea with us?"
"Yes, I'd love to."
Laurie then returned to the room, astonished to see his grandfather and new friend smiling and laughing together. The old gentleman did not say much as he drank his 4 cups of tea, but he watched the young people, who soon chatted away like old friends, and he observed quite a change in his grandson.
"The boy is lonely. I'll see what these little girls can do for him,"
thought Mr. Lawrence as he looked and listened. He liked Joe, for her strange but honest ways suited him, and she seemed to understand the boy almost as well as if she had been one herself. After they finished the tea, Joe planned to leave, but Laurie insisted that she see the indoor garden. As they entered the well-lighted room, she saw brightly colored flowers and wonderful trees all around. While she looked around in amazement, Laurie was busy cutting the finest flowers till his hands were full. Then he tied them up, saying, with a happy look,
"Please give these to your mother, and tell her I like the medicine she sent me very much."
They found Mr. Lawrence standing before the fire in the great sitting room, but Joe's attention was on the grand piano which stood open.
"Do you play?"
she asked, turning to Laurie.
"Sometimes,"
he answered modestly.
"Please do now. I want to hear it, so I can tell Beth."
So Laurie played and Joe listened, and her respect for the Lawrence boy increased very much, as he played remarkably well. She wished Beth could hear him, but she did not say so, and only praised him till he was red with embarrassment.
"That will do, young lady,"
said the grandfather.
"His music isn't bad, but I hope he will do as well in more important things. Are you leaving? Well, I'm so glad you could come, and I hope you'll visit us again. Say hello to your mother. Good night, Dr. Joe."
When he said goodbye, he looked rather upset, and when she and Laurie went into the hall, she asked if she had upset the old man.
"No, it was me. He doesn't like to hear me play."
"Why not?"
"I'll tell you someday. Will you come again, I hope?"
"If you promise to come and see us after you are well."
"I will."
"Good night, Laurie."
"Good night, Joe. Good night."
When all the afternoon's adventures had been told, the family felt they should all go visit. Mrs. March wished to talk of her father with the old man who had not forgotten him. Meg hoped to walk through the indoor garden. Beth wanted to see the grand piano, and Amy was eager to see the fine pictures.
Mother, why didn't Mr. Lawrence like to have Laurie play?
asked Joe.
I am not sure, but I think it was because his son, Laurie's father, married an Italian lady, a musician, which displeased the old man, who is very proud. The lady was good and lovely, but he did not like her and never saw his son after he married. They both died when Laurie was a little child, and then his grandfather took him home. I suppose the boy, who was born in Italy, is not very strong, and the old man is afraid of losing him, which makes him so careful. Laurie loves music just as his mother did, and I believe his grandfather fears that he may want to be a musician. Perhaps the grandson's skill reminds him of the woman he did not like.
Dear me, how romantic! Exclaimed Meg.
How silly,
said Joe.
Let him be a musician if he wants to, and not send him to college when he hates to go.
That's why he has such handsome black eyes and good manners, I suppose. Italians are always nice, said Meg.
Well, we'll all be good to the Lawrence boy because he hasn't got any mother, and he may come over and see us, right, Marmee?
Yes, Joe. Your little friend is very welcome any time, responded her mother. Chapter 6. Beth finds the palace beautiful. The big house was declared to be a palace beautiful by all, though it took some time for all to go, and little Beth found it particularly difficult to go. After old Mr. Lawrence's visit, none of the girls felt too afraid of him, except shy Beth. At first, the girls were unwilling to accept favors which they could not return, as Mr. Lawrence was quite wealthy, and the March girls were not. But after a while, they found that Mr. Lawrence was grateful for their attention to his grandson, so they soon forgot their pride. Everyone liked Laurie, and he privately informed his tutor that the Marches were splendid girls. With the delightful eagerness of youth, they took the lonely boy into their company. Never having known mother or sisters, he enjoyed their company a great deal. What good times they had! Such plays, walks, and evenings in the sitting room, and now and then such happy little parties at the great house. Meg could walk into the indoor garden whenever she liked. Joe looked over the new library, and Amy copied pictures and enjoyed the beauty of the place. But Beth, though wishing for the grand piano, did not have the courage to go to the Lawrences' home. She went once with Joe, but the old gentleman, not being aware of her shy manner, stared at her and said, "Hey!" so loud that he frightened her. She told her mother, and she ran away, declaring she would never go there any more, not even for the dear piano. Someone had told Mr. Lawrence of this, and he decided he must mend the matter quickly. During one of his brief visits, he spoke about his love for music. Beth listened carefully, slowly moving closer to him.
The boy neglects his music now, and I'm glad of it, for he was getting too fond of it. But the piano suffers now, as there is no one else to use it. Wouldn't some of your girls like to run over and practice on it, ma'am?
Beth took a step forward, still not saying a word.
They don't need to see or speak to anyone,
he continued,
but run in at any time. I'm usually in my study at the other end of the house, and Laurie is out a great deal, and the servants are never near there after 9 o'clock. Well, please tell the young ladies what I say, and if they don't care to come, well, never mind.
Then he stood up suddenly, moving toward the door. Here a little hand slipped into his, and Beth looked up at him with a face full of gratitude as she said, "Oh, sir, they do care very, very much."
Are you the musical girl?
He asked gently. "I'm Beth. I love it dearly, and I'll come if you are quite sure nobody will hear me and be disturbed," she added, fearing to be rude.
No one will be nearby, my dear. The house is empty half the day, so come and play as much as you like."
"How kind you are, sir." The old gentleman softly stroked her hair and stooped down to kiss her on the cheek, saying,
I had a little girl once, with eyes like these. Good day, madam.
And away he went in a great hurry. The next day, Beth went to the great house with the piano, and was quite surprised to find some music on the piano. At last, Beth touched the instrument, beginning to play. She stayed till Hannah came to take her home to dinner, but she had no appetite, and could only sit and smile upon everyone. After that, the little girl went to the great house nearly every day. She never knew that Mr. Lawrence often opened his door to hear the old music he liked. She never saw Laurie standing in the hall to keep the servants away, and she never suspected that the music which she found on the piano was put there for her, and when Mr. Lawrence talked to her about music at home, she only thought how kind he was to tell things that helped her so much. "Mother, I'm going to make Mr. Lawrence a pair of slippers. He is so kind to me. I must thank him, and I don't know any other way. Can I do it?" asked Beth, a few weeks after his visit.
"Yes, dear, it will please him very much, and be a nice way of thanking him. The girls will help you, and I will pay for the material,"
replied Mrs. March happily. Beth worked early and late on the slippers for quite some time, so they were soon finished, and she wrote a short, simple note, and with Laurie's help, got them onto Mr. Lawrence's desk one morning before he was up. Beth waited all day and part of the next before a response came from the old man. The next afternoon, however, when she returned from a walk around the neighborhood, she found a letter and a little piano waiting for her. "For me?" cried Beth.
"Yes, all for you, my precious. Isn't it splendid of him? Don't you think he's the dearest old man in the world? We didn't open the letter, but we are dying to know what he says,"
cried Jo, hugging her sister. "You read it. I can't. Oh, it is too lovely."
Miss March, Dear Madam, I have had many pairs of slippers in my life, but I never had any that suited me so well as yours. I hope you will allow me to send you something that once belonged to the little granddaughter I once had. I am grateful for your friendship and wish you the best. Sincerely, James Lawrence. Oh, Beth, now that's an honor to be proud of, I'm sure. Laurie told me how fond Mr. Lawrence used to be of the child who died, and how he kept all her little things carefully. He's given you her piano. You'll have to go and thank him,"
said Jo jokingly. "Yes, I guess I'll go now, before I get frightened thinking about it." And to the amazement of the family, Beth walked to the Lawrences' door. They would have been still more amazed if they had seen what Beth did afterward. She went and knocked at the door of his office, and when he called out,
Come in,
she did go in, right up to Mr. Lawrence, and held out her hand, saying, "I came to thank you, sir." But she didn't finish, for he looked so friendly that she forgot her speech, and suddenly remembering that he had lost the little girl he loved, she put both arms round his neck and kissed him. The old gentleman was astonished, but he liked it. He then set her on his knee as he had done with his granddaughter. Beth no longer feared him from that moment, and sat there talking to him as comfortably as if she had known him all her life. When she went home, he walked with her to her gate, then shook hands gently. Chapter 7. Amy's Shame. One morning, when the girls were sitting together outside, Laurie rode by on horseback.
"I wish I had a little of the money Laurie spends on that horse,"
said Amy quietly, hoping her sisters would hear. "Why?" asked Meg kindly.
"I need it so much. I am terribly in debt."
"In debt, Amy? What do you mean?" asked Meg, looking worried.
"Well, I owe candies to my classmates, and I can't pay them, till I have the money."
"Tell me all about it. Is it in fashion now to give candies to all your friends?"
"Well, you see, the girls are always buying them and giving them to each other. If one girl likes another, she gives her candy. If she's mad at her, she eats one in front of her and doesn't offer any. They treat in turns, and I've had so many, but haven't returned them. But I should, as they are debts of honor,
"How much will pay them off and restore your honor?" asked Meg, taking out her purse.
25 cents would more than do."
"Well, here's the money. Be careful with spending it."
"Oh, thank you. It must be so nice to have money. I'll have a wonderful time at school, as I haven't tasted any candy this week. I refused to take any, as I couldn't return them."
The next day, Amy was late to school, but after she arrived, her friends were immediately told that she had brought candies to share. Now, Mr. Davis had declared that candy would not be allowed in his classroom, and later that morning, he was informed that Amy March, one of his favorite students, had candy in her desk.
Young ladies, attention if you please. Miss March, come to the desk.
Amy went to his desk, hiding her fear.
Bring with you the candy you have in your desk,
he continued.
Now, I want you to throw it all out of the window. Now, young ladies, you must remember what I said to you a week ago. I am sorry this has happened, but I never allow my rules to be broken. Miss March, hold out your hand.
Amy then put both hands out and bore several blows on the back of her hands. They were neither many nor heavy, but that made no difference to her. For the first time in her life she had been struck, and the shame in her eyes was as deep as if he had knocked her down. As if that embarrassing event was not enough, Amy was forced to stand in the corner of the room for the next 15 minutes until their break, but she refused to cry. When the break arrived, Amy went straight home and left the place forever, as she declared to herself. She was in a sad state when she got home, and when the older girls arrived some time later, they were quite angry at what they were told. Mrs. March did not say much, but looked disturbed, and comforted her little daughter in her most tender manner.
"Yes, you can have a vacation from school, but I want you to study a little every day with Beth,"
said Mrs. March that evening.
"I don't approve of Mr. Davis's manner of punishment, and so I shall ask your father's advice before I send you anywhere else." "That's good. I wish all the girls would leave and ruin his school. Those perfectly good candies were all destroyed," cried Amy. "I am not sorry you lost them, for you broke the rules and deserved some punishment,"
said her mother, which rather disappointed the young lady, who expected nothing but sympathy. Chapter 8. Joe's Sorrow.
"Girls, where are you going?"
asked Amy, coming into their room one Saturday afternoon and finding them getting ready to go out.
"Never mind. Little girls shouldn't ask questions,"
returned Joe coldly. Turning to Meg, who never refused her anything very long, she said sweetly,
"Do tell me. I know you would let me go, too. I don't have anything to do, and am so lonely."
"I can't, dear, because you aren't invited," began Meg.
"Now, Meg, be quiet or you will spoil it all. You can't go, Amy, so don't be a baby and complain about it." "You are going somewhere with Laurie. I know you are. You were whispering and laughing together on the sofa last night, and you stopped when I came in. Aren't you going with him?" "Yes, we are. Now stop bothering." I know,"
exclaimed Amy after a few moments.
"You're going to the theater,"
she cried.
"and I shall go. I have my own money, so I can buy my own ticket."
"Now listen to me, and be a good child," said Meg. "Mother doesn't wish you to go this week. Next week you can go with Beth and Hannah and have a nice time."
"I want to go with you and Laurie. Please let me."
"Well, suppose we take her. I don't believe Mother would mind," began Meg.
"If she goes, then I won't, and if I don't, Laurie won't like it, and it will be very rude, after he invited only us,"
said Joe angrily.
"I shall go. Meg says I can, and if I pay for myself, Laurie shouldn't be concerned about me,"
cried Amy.
"You can't sit with us, as our seats are reserved, and you must not sit alone, so Laurie will give you his place, and that will ruin our pleasure, or he'll get another seat for you, and that isn't proper when you weren't asked. You will not go,"
scolded Joe. Sitting on the floor with one boot on, Amy began to cry when Laurie arrived, and the two girls hurried out, leaving their sister crying loudly.
"You'll be sorry for this, Joe March,"
the little girl exclaimed as the two left. When they returned, after a pleasurable time at the theater, they found Amy reading, refusing to say a word. Joe soon noticed that Amy had thrown the contents of her drawer on the floor, though she soon discovered everything was there. The next day, however, she realized something was missing. Meg, Beth, and Amy were sitting together late in the afternoon when Joe burst into the room, asking,
"Has anyone taken my book?"
Meg and Beth said no at once and looked surprised. Amy said nothing.
"Amy, you've got it." "No, I don't." "You know where it is, then." "No, I don't." "That's a lie,"
cried Joe.
"It isn't. I don't have it, don't know where it is now, and don't care." "You know something about it, and you'd better tell me now." "Scold as much as you like. You'll never see your silly old book again,"
cried Amy.
"Why not?" "I burned it in the fireplace." "What? My little book I was so fond of and worked over and planned to finish before Father got home? Did you really burn it?"
asked Joe, turning very pale.
"Yes, I did." "You evil, evil girl! I can never write it again, and I'll never forgive you as long as I live,"
Joe exclaimed before running out of the room. A few hours later at dinner, Joe appeared, looking more upset than ever. Mrs. March had easily explained to Amy how she had deeply wronged her sister, as that book had been Joe's pride and had taken several years to write. At dinner, Amy found it very difficult to apologize to her sister.
"Please forgive me, Joe. I'm very, very sorry." "I shall never forgive you,"
Joe answered coldly, and from that moment she refused to speak to the girl, quite deeply offending Amy.
"Everybody is so hateful. I'll ask Laurie to go skating. He is always kind and cheery,"
said Joe to herself. Amy saw Joe take out her skates and decided to follow her older sister, hoping she could do something kind for her on the way. After Joe and Laurie had put on their skates, Laurie skated off, calling back,
"Stay near the shore. It isn't safe in the middle."
Joe heard, but Amy was far behind, still putting on her skates, and did not hear his warning.
"No matter whether she heard or not, let her take care of herself,"
Joe thought to herself. Laurie was now far ahead, while Amy was behind Joe, moving toward the smoother ice in the middle. For a minute, Joe stood still with a strange feeling in her heart, but decided to continue. But she then turned around, just in time to see her sister fall through the ice into the water. She tried to call Laurie, but her voice was gone. She tried to go to her sister, but her feet refused to move, and for a second she only stood watching in terror. Laurie then rushed past her, and she followed. During the next few minutes, she obeyed Laurie's orders, helping pull her frightened sister out from the icy water. They managed to get the little girl home, and she was soon asleep under blankets in front of the fireplace. When Amy was comfortably asleep, and Mrs. March sitting by the bed, she called Joe to her.
"Are you sure she is safe?"
whispered Joe.
"Quite safe, dear. She is not hurt, and you are so quick in covering her and getting her home,"
replied her mother cheerfully.
"Laurie did it all. I only let her go. Mother, if she should die, it would be my fault. It's my terrible temper,"
Joe cried, telling all that had happened, bitterly blaming herself, and crying with gratitude that little Amy's life had been spared. The mother felt a great deal of pity for her suffering child, seeing how guilty she felt, and Joe sincerely promised her mother that she would learn to control her anger.
"I went to sleep angry, and I wouldn't forgive her, and today, if it hadn't been for Laurie, it might have been too late. How could I be so horrible?"
said Joe, half aloud as she stroked her sister's hair gently. As if she heard, Amy opened her eyes and held out her arms, with a smile on her face. Neither said a word, but they hugged one another close, and everything was forgiven and forgotten. Chapter 9. Meg's Visit.
"It's so nice that Annie Moffat did not forget her promise to have you visit. A whole 2 weeks of fun will be splendid,"
said Joe one morning while watching Meg pack for her visit. "And such lovely weather. I'm so glad of that," added Beth.
"I wish I was going to have a fine time and wear all these nice things,"
said Amy. "Well, I wish you were all going, but as you can't, I'll tell you all about my adventures when I come back," said Meg, looking at the old dresses she was packing. "I wonder if I shall ever be happy enough to have many lovely new dresses, as Annie Moffat has. You said the other day that you'd be perfectly happy if you could only go to Annie Moffat's," Beth observed in her quiet way. "So I did. Well, I am happy, and I won't worry. But it does seem that the more one gets, the more one wants," she responded cheerfully. The next day was fine, and Meg departed in style for 2 weeks of comfort and pleasure. Mrs. March had agreed to the visit rather unwillingly, fearing that Margaret would come back more discontented than when she went, after experiencing such wealth and ease. Meg wished desperately to go, however, and her mother at last agreed, thinking a little pleasure seemed so delightful after the difficult winter. The Moffats were quite fashionable, and simple Meg was a bit shocked at the grand house and family. But they were kind people, and soon put their guest at ease. The more she saw of Annie Moffat's pretty things, the more she envied her and wished to be rich. Home now looked bare and depressing as she thought of it, but she did not have much time for thinking of home, as Annie was always taking her shopping, walking, riding, and visiting, calling her Daisy instead of Meg. Annie had many friends and knew how to entertain them. When the evening for the small party came, Meg decided that the one dress she had been wearing was unacceptable compared with Annie's new ones. No one said a word about it, but Sally offered her another dress for the evening. But Meg saw only pity for her poverty in the kind offer. Soon, however, the maid brought in a box of flowers for Meg, which had come from Laurie.
"What fun! Who are they from? We didn't know you had a lover," cried the girls.
"The note is from Mother, and the flowers from Laurie," said Meg simply.
"Oh, indeed,"
said Annie, giving Meg a curious look. The note had cheered her a great deal, and the flowers as well. She enjoyed herself very much that evening, for she danced and sang, and someone said she had beautiful eyes. So she had a very nice time, till she heard a bit of conversation that disturbed her. She was sitting down after dancing for quite some time, when she heard two voices speaking on the other side of the flowery wall.
"How old is he?"
16 or 17,
replied another voice.
"It would be grand for one of those girls to marry him. His grandfather is quite fond of them as well."
"Mrs. March has made her plans for the girl, though a bit early," said Mrs. Moffat. "She told that lie about her mother sending the note, and was quite embarrassed when the flowers came, poor thing. She'd be so nice if she was only more stylish. Do you think she'd be offended if we offered to lend her a dress for Thursday?"
asked another voice.
"She's proud, but I don't believe she'd mind, for that old dress she has now may be torn tonight."
"We'll see. I shall ask young Lawrence to come on Thursday as well."
Someone then came to ask Meg to dance, so she heard no more, but was quite upset the rest of the night, though she refused to show it. That night Meg had difficulty sleeping, and woke up more anxious and upset than when she went to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, however, Meg realized, as she looked around at the other girls present, that they treated her with more respect, took quite an interest in what she said, and looked at her with eyes full of curiosity. All this surprised and pleased her, and put her more at ease for the coming party on Thursday. Sally informed her that she planned to invite "your friend, Mr. Lawrence," though Meg again explained he was simply a friend rather than a lover. Meg was feeling so cheerful before the party on Thursday that Sally finally convinced her to wear one of her beautiful silk dresses. Meg couldn't refuse the offer so kindly made, particularly after Sally and her sisters promised to make a little beauty of her. That evening, the girls made Meg into a fine lady, curling her hair, making up her face, and giving her earrings, a necklace, and bracelets to wear.
"I'm afraid to go down to the party,"
said Meg to Sally, after seeing in the mirror that she was a little beauty, but not finding herself as she looked.
"You don't look a bit like yourself, but you are very nice," returned Sally,
trying not to care that Meg looked prettier than she did. That evening, Meg danced and laughed with young gentlemen, but suddenly stopped when she saw Laurie. He was staring at her in surprise and disapproval. "I'm glad you came. I was afraid you wouldn't," she said, trying to look confident in her new look.
Joe wanted me to come and tell her how you looked. So I did,"
answered Laurie. "What will you tell her?" asked Meg, full of curiosity.
"I will say that I didn't know you, as you look so grown up and unlike yourself. I'm quite afraid of you."
"Oh," Meg said nervously after a pause. "Oh, Laurie, I want you to do me a favor. Please don't tell them at home about my dress tonight. They won't understand, and it'll worry Mother. I will tell them myself all about it, but I'd rather do it myself."
"I promise that I won't say a word to them."
"Thank you. Just say that I looked happy and well and was having a good time." Later that evening, as Meg was resting in one of the side rooms after dancing, she heard someone pass by saying,
"They are making a fool of that little girl. I wanted you to see her, but they have spoiled her entirely. She's nothing but a doll tonight."
"Oh dear," said Meg to herself. "I wish I'd worn my own things. Then I would not have felt so uncomfortable and ashamed of myself." The next Saturday, Meg went home, quite eager to be with her family again. It does seem pleasant to be quiet and not have company manners all the time. Home is a nice place, though it isn't splendid, said Meg, the day after her return home, sitting on the sofa with her mother and Joe. Meg had told everyone her adventures and what a charming time she had had. But after the younger girls went to bed, and she was left alone with her mother and Joe, she decided she must explain what had happened at the parties. "Marmee, I need to tell you something."
"I thought so. What is it, dear?"
Meg then explained what had happened at the two parties and how terrible she had felt after the second. Her mother was quite worried, however, after hearing that the other girls believed she and Laurie to be lovers.
"Now, my dear, I want you to forget that foolish talk as soon as you can. I was very unwise to let you go among people of whom I know so little. I am more sorry than I can express for the trouble it has caused you, Meg. Now, think nothing more of what those foolish people said. One thing to remember, my girls, Mother is always here for you to trust, and you children will always be the pride and comfort of our lives."
Chapter 10. Experiments. The 1st of June. The Kings are off to the seashore tomorrow, and I'm free. 3 months' vacation. How I shall enjoy it, exclaimed Meg, coming home one warm day.
"Aunt March went today, for which I'm joyful,"
said Joe.
"I was afraid she'd ask me to go with her on her trip. I felt so relieved when she finally left." "What shall you do all your vacation?"
asked Amy. "I shall do nothing but rest and sleep," replied Meg. "I've had to wake up early all winter and had to spend my days working for other people. So now I'm going to rest as I please."
"No,"
said Joe.
"that won't suit me. I've many new books to read. I'm going to spend all my time reading." "Let's not do any lessons, Beth, for a while, but play all the time and rest, as the girls will do," suggested Amy.
"Well, I will if Mother doesn't mind. I want to learn some new songs." "May we, Mother?" asked Meg, turning to Mrs. March, who sat nearby.
"You may try your experiment for a week and see how you like it." I think by Saturday night you will find that all play and no work is as bad as all work and no play."
"Oh dear, no! It will be wonderful, I'm sure," said Meg eagerly. The next morning, Meg did not appear till 10 o'clock. Her breakfast alone was not as pleasant as she had hoped, and the room seemed lonely and unclean, as no one had done their duties that morning. In fact, nothing in the house was neat and pleasant, aside from Marmy's corner of the sitting room. Meg sat there to rest and read, imagining what pretty summer dresses she would buy with her salary. Joe spent the morning on the river with Laurie, and the afternoon reading. Beth spent the morning with her music, pleased that she had no dishes to wash. Amy sat down to draw flowers, hoping someone would see and compliment her work. As no one appeared, she went for a walk, just before it rained, and came home wet and cold. At lunch they compared notes, and all agreed that it had been a delightful day, though unusually long. Meg went shopping in the afternoon, but soon discovered a spot on her new dress. Joe got a terrible headache by reading too long. Beth was finding it difficult to learn 3 or 4 songs at once, and Amy deeply regretted going for a walk in the rain, which had greatly damaged her dress, and she now had nothing to wear on her visit to a friend's the next day. But these problems the girls had were small, and they assured their mother that the experiment was working quite well. She smiled, said nothing, and with Hannah's help did their duties around the house, keeping home pleasant. It was astonishing what a strange and uncomfortable state the house was in with everyone resting. The days kept getting longer and longer, and the girls became upset more easily, quarreling quite a bit more often. No one would admit that they were tired of the experiment, but by Friday night, each realized that she was glad the week was nearly over. Mrs. March then decided to finish off the experiment in an appropriate manner, so she gave Hannah a holiday. When they got up on Saturday morning, there was no fire in the kitchen, no breakfast in the dining room, and no mother anywhere to be seen.
"What has happened?"
cried Joe in shock. Meg ran upstairs and soon came back again to declare that their mother planned to stay quietly in her room all day, so the girls would have to amuse themselves for the day. "She says it's been a hard week for her, so we mustn't complain, but take care of ourselves."
"That's easy enough, and I like the idea. I've been wanting something to do."
In fact, it was a relief to them all to have a little work, and they got started quickly. Beth and Amy set the table, while Meg and Joe got breakfast, wondering as they did why servants ever complained about the work. "I shall take some up to Mother, though she said we were not to think of her, for she'd take care of herself," said Meg. So their mother was served bitter tea, burned eggs, and salty bread. But Mrs. March thanked them sweetly and laughed after the girls were gone. She had provided herself with food for the day, but did not wish to hurt their feelings by refusing their breakfast. Many were the complaints below to the embarrassment of the cooks, but Joe was determined to finish the duties of the day, and declared that she would have a dinner party that evening with invited guests. The failed breakfast, however, was Joe's first ever attempt at cooking, and the others had their doubts about the dinner. She spent the rest of the day in the kitchen, attempting new dishes for the dinner party. After becoming frustrated that cooking was a more difficult task than she had believed it to be, she went into the sitting room to rest for a bit. There she found Beth crying over Pip, the family bird, which lay dead in the cage. "It's all my fault. I forgot him. There isn't any food or water for him. Oh, Pip! Oh, Pip! How could I be so cruel to you?" cried Beth.
"The funeral shall be this evening, and we will all go. Now don't cry, Beth. It's a pity, but nothing has gone right this week, and Pip has experienced the worst of the experiment. After the dinner party, we'll have a nice little funeral,"
said Joe before returning to the kitchen. At last the dinner was ready, and Joe felt a great deal of anxiety just beforehand, and the dinner she served up became a joke thereafter. Fearing to ask advice, she did her best alone, and discovered that cooking, indeed, was a rather difficult task. She boiled the vegetables for too long, and was upset to see they were too soft. The bread burned black, the salad dressing did not mix, the meat was tough and rather difficult to cut, and the potatoes were not finished. She was rather proud of the dessert, however, being strawberries and sugared cream. After the ruined dinner was finished, she walked out with the dessert proudly and watched as each one tasted the creation. Quite horrified and shocked she was when all present quietly but quickly spat the first bite into their napkins.
"Oh, what is it?"
exclaimed Joe. "Salt instead of sugar, and the cream is sour," replied Meg. Unfortunately, in her rush to prepare the dinner, she had not put the cream in the refrigerator and had used the bag of salt rather than sugar. After dinner was finished, and poor Pip's funeral conducted, the girls went to the sitting room after a tiring day.
"What a terrible day this has been,"
began Joe, usually the first to speak.
"Not a bit like home,"
added Amy. "It can't be like home without Marmee and little Pip," said Beth sadly.
"Here's Mother, dear, and you shall have another bird tomorrow if you want one," she said cheerfully. "Are you satisfied with your experiment, girls, or do you want another week of it?"
she asked.
"I don't,"
cried Joe. "Nor I," agreed the others.
"Suppose you learn a bit of cooking, Joe. That is quite useful,"
said Mrs. March, laughing quietly to herself.
"Now, girls, you understand how the comfort of home all depends on each doing her duties. While Hannah and I did your work, you did quite well, though I don't think you were very happy. Don't you feel that it is more pleasant to help one another to make home comfortable and lovely to us all?"
"We do, Mother, we do," cried the girls.
"Then you must take up your duties again tomorrow. I know they sometimes seem difficult, but they become easier with time." "We'll work and love it too,"
said Joe.
"I'll learn to cook, so my next dinner party will be a success."
"I'll make the next shirts for Father, instead of letting you do it, Marmee," said Meg. "I'll do my lessons every day and not spend so much time with my music," decided Beth.
"Very good. Then I am quite satisfied with the experiment, and am sure we do not have to repeat it. Make each day both useful and pleasant."
"We will, Mother." And they did. Chapter 11. Castles in the Air. One late afternoon, Laurie was walking around, wondering what his neighbors were doing, but too lazy to go and find out. He had spent the day avoiding his studies, quite upsetting Mr. Brooke and displeasing his grandfather. Soon he heard voices and looked up to see the 4 March sisters leave their house.
What in the world are those girls doing now?
Thought Laurie. all walked quietly through the garden and out of the little gate, beginning to climb the hill between the house and the river.
Well, that's not too nice,
said Laurie to himself.
to have a picnic and never ask me. Perhaps they forgot to ask me. I'll go see.
As he walked to find them after a few minutes, he thought it was rather a pretty little picture, as the sisters sat together under a tree. Meg sat sewing gently with her white hands and looking fresh and sweet. Beth was sorting leaves that lay nearby, for she made pretty things of them. Amy was drawing, and Jo was knitting as she read aloud. A shadow passed over the boy's face as he watched them, feeling that he should go away because uninvited, yet waiting because home seemed very lonely and this quiet party in the woods attracted him. Soon enough, Beth looked up, giving him a friendly smile.
May I come in, please? Or shall I be a bother?
He asked, walking forward slowly. Meg looked at Jo anxiously, but Jo said at once,
Of course you may. We should have asked you before, but we thought you wouldn't care for such a girls' game as this.
I always like your games, but if Meg doesn't want me, I'll go away.
You can stay if you do something. It's against the rules not to do anything, replied Meg.
Thank you. I'll do anything you ask. Shall I sew, read, arrange leaves, draw, or do all at once?
And Laurie sat down, delighted to join the party.
Finish this story while I knit,
said Jo, handing him the book.
Yes, ma'am,
he answered quietly as he began. The story was not a long one, and when it was finished, he decided to ask a few questions.
Please, ma'am, could you tell me if this charming club is a new one?
Would you tell him? Asked Meg of her sisters.
He'll laugh,
said Amy anxiously.
Who cares?
Said Jo. I guess he'll like it, added Beth.
Of course I will. I promise I won't laugh. Tell me, Jo.
Well, we have a new plan in which we have tried not to waste our holiday, but each has had a task and worked at it. The vacation is nearly over, and we want to make sure that we do not waste the rest of it, but do useful things,
she explained. Mother likes us to be outside as much as possible, so we bring our work here and have nice times. For the fun of it, we bring our things in these bags, Meg continued. We come to this hill to look far away to see the country where we hope to live sometime. Jo pointed, and Laurie sat up to examine, across the woods, the blue river and the countryside, to where the green hills met the blue sky, spotted with clouds, looking much like some heavenly city.
How beautiful that is,
said Laurie softly, for he was quick to see and feel beauty of any kind.
It's often so, and we like to watch it, for it is never the same, but always splendid,
replied Amy, wishing she could paint it. There is a place more beautiful even than that, where we shall go if we are good enough after we die, answered Meg with her sweet voice. It seems so long to wait, so hard to do. I want to fly away and go to that splendid place, said Beth with a smile.
You'll get there, Beth, sooner or later. No fear of that,
said Jo.
I'm the one that will have to work and wait to get to heaven, and maybe never get there after all.
You'll have me for company if that's any comfort. If I arrive late, you'll say a good word for me, won't you, Beth?
Asked Laurie with a troubled look. If people really want to go and really try all their lives, I think they will get there.
Wouldn't it be fun if all the castles in the air which we make could come true, and we could live in them?
Said Jo, after a little pause.
Well, I'll tell you mine first,
replied Laurie eagerly.
After I've seen as much of the world as I want to, I'd like to settle in Germany and have just as much music as I choose. I would be a famous musician myself, and everyone would rush to hear me, and I would never be worried about money or business, but just enjoy myself and live for what I like. What's yours, Meg?
Well, I should like a lovely house, full of grand things, nice food, pretty clothes, handsome furniture, pleasant people, and a great deal of money. I would have many servants, so I won't have to work a bit. How I would enjoy it! I wouldn't be lazy, though, as I would do good and make everyone love me dearly.
Wouldn't you have a husband for your castle in the air?
Asked Laurie curiously. I said pleasant people, you know.
Why don't you say you'd have a splendid, wise, good husband and some wonderful little children? You know your castle wouldn't be perfect without,
said Joe with a laugh. You'd have nothing but horses and books in yours, answered Meg.
Yes, I'd have many horses and rooms filled with books, and I'd write as well. My works would be as famous as Laurie's music. I want to do something splendid before I go into my castle, something wonderful that won't be forgotten after I'm dead. I don't know what, but I'm looking for it, and will astonish you all some day. I think I shall write books and get rich and famous. That would suit me, so that is my favorite dream.
Mine is to stay at home safe with Father and Mother and help take care of the family, said Beth contentedly.
Don't you wish for anything else?
Asked Laurie. Since I have my little piano, I am perfectly satisfied. I only wish we may all stay well and be together, nothing else.
I have so many wishes, but my favorite one is to be an artist and go to Rome and make fine pictures and be the best artist in the whole world,
was Amy's modest desire.
Well, every one of us but Beth wants to be rich and famous. I do wonder if any of us will ever get our wishes,
said Laurie.
If we are all alive 10 years from now, let's meet and see how many of us have got our wishes, or how much closer we are to them then than now,
said Joe, always ready with a plan. Well, I shall be 27, exclaimed Meg, who felt grown up already, having just reached 17.
You and I will be 26, Laurie, Beth 24, and Amy 22,
said Joe. That night, when Beth played to Mr. Lawrence, Laurie listened to the music, which always quieted his spirit, and watched the old man, who sat with his gray head on his hand, thinking tender thoughts of the dead child he had loved so much. Remembering the conversation of the afternoon, the boy said to himself cheerfully,
I'll let my castle go and stay here with the dear old gentleman while he needs me, for I am all he has.
Chapter 12. Secrets. One morning, Jo was very busy writing, seated alone on the old sofa, with her papers spread out on the table before her. Quite absorbed in her work, Jo wrote away till the last page was filled, when she signed her name and threw down her pen, exclaiming,
There, I've done my best. If this won't suit, I shall have to wait till I can do better.
Lying back on the sofa, she read the story carefully. Then she tied it up and sat a minute looking at it with satisfaction before putting on her hat and jacket as quietly as possible. She then walked out of the back door in the direction of the town, looking very merry and mysterious. If anyone had been watching her, he would have thought her movements quite strange, as she walked rather quickly till she reached a certain address on a busy street in the center of town. She went into the doorway, looked up the dirty stairs, and after standing a minute, walked away as quickly as she had come. She repeated this several times, which greatly amused young Laurie, who was hiding nearby. On returning for the third time, Joe finally walked up the stairs. In 10 minutes, Joe came running downstairs with a very red face, looking pleased with herself. When she saw young Laurie, she looked anything but pleased, and passed him with a nod.
"Where were you going, Joe?"
He asked with a naughty smile.
"What are you doing in town?"
She responded, looking annoyed.
"Were you at a pub drinking?"
No, ma'am, I was at a gymnasium taking a lesson in fencing.
"I'm glad to hear that.
Why?
You can teach me, and then when we have our next play, we'll have a lovely fencing scene."
I'll teach you whether we have a play or not. It's great fun. But I don't believe that was your only reason for saying. I'm glad to hear that. In such a manner, was it now?
No, I was glad that you were not in a pub, because I hope you never go to such places, do you?
Not often.
I wish you wouldn't.
It's no harm, Joe. Ned Moffat and a few others often go.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry, as you'll become more fond of it, and will waste time and money, and grow like those terrible boys. I did hope you'd stay respectable, and be a satisfaction to your friends,
said Joe disapprovingly.
Can't a young man enjoy himself at a pub now and then, without losing his respectability?
Asked Laurie, looking bothered.
That depends upon how and where he enjoys himself. I don't like those young men, and wish you'd stay away from them. Mother won't let us have that boy in our house, though he wants to come, and if you grow like him, she won't allow us to spend time with you either.
Won't she?
Asked Laurie anxiously.
No, she can't bear young men like that.
Well, she need not worry. I don't plan to spend any more time with them.
Just be a simple, honest, respectable boy, and we'll never desert you. I hear people talk about money being such a temptation, and I sometimes wish you were poor. Then I wouldn't worry about you.
Do you worry about me, Joe?
A little when you look upset, as you sometimes do.
Laurie walked in silence a few minutes, and Joe watched him, wishing she had not spoken, as his eyes looked angry, though his lips still smiled.
Are you going to talk this way all the way home?
He asked.
Of course not. Why?
Because if you are, I'll take a bus. If you are not, I'd like to walk with you and tell you something very interesting.
I'll stop, and I'd like to hear the news very much.
All right, then, come on. It's secret, and if I tell you, you must tell me yours.
I don't have a secret,
began Joe, but stopped suddenly, remembering that she did have a secret.
Yes, you do. You can't hide anything. So tell me, or I won't tell you mine,
cried Laurie.
Is your secret a nice one?
Oh, it's wonderful. All about people you know, and such fun. You should hear it, and I've been wanting to tell someone for quite some time. Now, you begin.
You won't tell anyone about it at home, will you?
Not a word.
And you won't tease me about it?
I never tease.
Yes, you do. You somehow get everyone to tell you their secrets. I don't know how you do it, but you always do.
Thank you. Now tell me.
Well, I left 2 stories with a newspaper man, and he'll tell me next week if he's going to use them,
whispered Joe.
Miss March, the celebrated American author,
cried Laurie, throwing up his hat and catching it again.
Hush! Perhaps he won't even use the stories. But I couldn't rest till I tried, and I said nothing about it because I didn't want anyone else to be disappointed.
It won't fail. Joe, your stories are works of Shakespeare compared to half the foolish things published every day. Won't it be fun to see them in the paper? and we'll be so proud of our author."
Well, thank you,
said Joe shyly.
Now, what's your secret?
"I may have troubles later for telling, but I didn't promise not to, so I will. I know that Meg had lost one of her gloves, and I know who has it."
Is that all?
Said Joe, looking disappointed. Laurie then bent down to Joe's ear, explaining that his tutor, Mr. Brooke, had the glove. She stood and stared at him for a minute, looking both surprised and displeased, then walked on, saying,
How do you know?
"I saw it.
Where is it?
In his pocket."
All this time since she lost it, he's been holding it?
"Yes, isn't that romantic?
No, it's terrible.
Don't you like it?"
Of course I don't. It's ridiculous. It won't be allowed. What would Meg say?
"You are not to tell anyone, remember that."
I didn't promise.
"That was understood, and I trusted you."
Well, I won't say anything for now, but I'm disgusted and wish you hadn't told me.
"I thought you'd be pleased."
At the idea of anybody coming to take Meg away? No, thank you.
"You'll feel better about it when somebody comes to take you away."
I'd like to see anyone try it.
cried Joe.
"So I will."
Laurie exclaimed jokingly.
I don't think secrets agree with me. I feel strange since you told me that,
said Joe,
"Run down the hill with me and you'll be all right."
suggested Laurie. No one was in sight, so Joe ran. After reaching the bottom of the hill, Joe immediately began fixing her hair, hoping no one would pass by till she looked like a ladylike young woman again. But someone did pass, and who should it be but Meg, looking quite ladylike herself, as she had been walking through town visiting. "What are you doing here?" she asked in surprise.
Getting leaves,
answered Joe quietly. "You have been running, Joe. When will you stop such boyish ways?" said Meg, looking disappointed in her sister's behavior.
Never till I'm too old to move. Don't try to make me grow up before my time, Meg. It's hard enough to have you change all of a sudden. Let me be a little girl as long as I can.
As she spoke, Joe bent over the leaves to hide her saddened face. Lately, she had felt that Margaret was fast becoming a woman, and Laurie's secret made her fear the separation which must surely come sometime, and now seemed very near. Laurie saw the trouble in her face, and drew Meg's attention from it by asking quickly,
"Where have you been visiting looking so nice?"
"At the gardener's, and Sally Moffat has been telling me about her sister's lovely wedding. It was splendid, and they have gone to spend the winter in Paris. How delightful that must be!"
"Do you envy her, Meg?"
said Laurie. "Indeed, I do."
I'm glad of it,
whispered Joe. "Why?" asked Meg, looking surprised.
Because if you care much about riches, you will never go and marry a poor man,
said Joe, looking angrily at Laurie. "I shall never go and marry anyone," observed Meg, walking on while the others followed, laughing, whispering, and behaving like children, as Meg said to herself. For a week or two, Joe behaved so oddly that her sisters were quite confused. She ran to the door when the newspaper arrived, was rude to Mr. Brooke whenever they met, would sit looking at Meg sadly, occasionally jumping up to kiss her in a very mysterious manner. Laurie and Joe were always talking secretly till the other girls declared they had both lost their minds. On the second Saturday, after Joe had gone to the newspaper office, Meg watched through the window in surprise as Laurie and Joe ran through the garden towards the house, screaming and laughing together. "What shall we do with that girl?" She never will behave like a young lady, said Meg, as she watched disapprovingly.
I hope she won't. She is so funny and dear as she is,
said Beth, who had never betrayed that she was a little hurt at Joe having secrets with anyone but her. In a few minutes, Joe came into the house and laid herself on the sofa, pretending to read. Do you have something interesting there? Asked Meg.
Nothing but a story,
returned Joe.
You'd better read it aloud. That will amuse us and keep you from misbehaving,
said Amy. Joe began reading, and the girls listened with interest, as the story was romantic and somewhat sorrowful, as most of the characters died in the end.
Who wrote it?
Asked Beth, after Joe had finished the story. The reader suddenly sat up, saying,
Your sister,
in a loud voice. You? Cried Meg, dropping her work.
It's very good,
exclaimed Amy.
I knew it! I knew it! Oh, my Joe, I am so proud!
And Beth ran to hug her sister. How delighted they all were. Meg wouldn't believe it till she saw the words Miss Josephine March actually printed in the paper, and how proud her mother was when she knew it. Joe laughed with tears in her eyes as the paper passed from hand to hand.
Tell us all about it.
When did it come?
How much did you get for it? What will Father say?
Won't Laurie laugh? Cried the family as they gathered around Joe.
Stop talking, girls, and I'll tell you everything,
said Joe. Having told how she delivered the stories, Joe added,
And when I went to get my answer, the man said he liked them both, but didn't pay beginners, only let them print in his paper. It was good practice, he said, and when the beginners improved, anyone would pay. So I let him have the 2 stories, and today this was sent to me, and Laurie caught me with it, and insisted on seeing it, so I let him. He said it was good, and I shall write more, and the newspaper man's going to pay me for the next, and I am so happy. In time, I may be able to support myself and help the girls.
She then wrapped her head in the paper, crying a few small tears of happiness. To be independent and be praised by those she loved were the dearest wishes of her heart, and this seemed to be the first step toward that happy end. Chapter 13. A Telegram. November is the most disagreeable month in the whole year, said Margaret, standing at the window one dull afternoon, looking out at the frozen garden.
If something very pleasant should happen now, we would think it a delightful month,
said Beth, who took a hopeful view of everything, even November. Perhaps, but nothing pleasant ever does happen in this family, said Meg.
2 pleasant things are going to happen right away. Marmee is coming down the street, and Laurie is walking through the garden towards the house, as if he had something nice to tell, returned Beth.
In they both came, Mrs. March with her usual question.
Any letter from Father, girls?
And Laurie asked,
Won't some of you come for a walk? I've been studying all the morning and need some fresh air. It's a dull day, but the air isn't bad, and I'm going to take Brooke home, so it will be a wonderful time. Come, Joe, you and Beth will go, won't you?
Of course we will.
I'm sorry, but I'm busy, said Meg, picking up her sewing.
We 3 will be ready in a minute,
cried Amy, running away to wash her hands.
Can I do anything for you, Madam Mother?
asked Laurie, leaning over Mrs. March's chair with a smile.
No, thank you, except go to the post office, if you'd be so kind, dear. It's our day for a letter from Mr. March, and the postman hasn't come yet.
A ring interrupted her, and a minute later, Hannah came in with a letter. It's one of those horrible telegrams, ma'am, she said. At the word telegram, Mrs. March grabbed it, read the short message, and fell back into her chair, looking quite pale. Laurie ran downstairs for water, while Meg and Hannah supported her, and Joe read aloud, in a frightened voice,
Mrs. March, your husband is very ill. Come immediately. S. Hale, Blank Hospital, Washington.
How still the room was as they listened. How strangely the day darkened outside, and how suddenly the whole world seemed to change as the girls gathered around their mother, feeling as if all the happiness and support of their lives was about to be taken from them. Mrs. March then read the message over and stretched out her arms to her daughters, saying,
I shall go immediately, but it may be too late. Oh, children, children, help me to bear it.
For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of crying in the room. Poor Hannah was the first to speak, and with great wisdom that gave them all strength. I won't waste time crying, but instead get your things ready right away, ma'am, she said, wiping the tears away from her face.
She's right. There's no time for tears now. Be calm, girls, and let me think,
said Mrs. March. They tried to be calm, poor things, as their mother sat up, looking pale, and put away her grief to think and plan for them.
Where's Laurie?
She asked.
Here, ma'am. Oh, let me do something,
cried the boy, hurrying from the next room where he had been waiting, feeling that the family needed time alone together in their sorrow.
Send a telegram saying I will come immediately. The next train goes early in the morning. I'll take that.
What else? I can go anywhere, do anything,
he said eagerly.
Leave a note at Aunt March's. Joe, give me that pen and paper, she said, as she began writing a letter to Aunt March, requesting money for the trip, as she knew money would have to be borrowed to care for her husband. Joe, run to the store to get these things. They'll be needed, and I must go prepared for nursing. Hospital stores are not always good. Beth, go ask Mr. Lawrence for a couple of bottles of old wine. I'm not too proud to beg for Father. He shall have the best of everything. Amy, tell Hannah to get my luggage. And Meg, come and help me find my things.
Writing, thinking, and directing all at once was quite stressful for the poor lady, and Meg begged her to sit quietly in her room for a little while and let them work. Everyone moved quickly, and the quiet, happy household was broken up suddenly. Mr. Lawrence hurried back with Beth, bringing every comfort the kind old gentleman could think of, and friendliest promises of protection for the girls during their mother's absence, which comforted her very much. A short time later, as Meg was preparing her mother's things, Mr. Brooke came in suddenly.
I'm very sorry to hear of this, Miss March,
he said in the kind, quiet tone that sounded very pleasant to her worried spirit.
I came to tell your mother that I would be most willing to take her safely to Washington. Mr. Lawrence has allowed me to go, and it will give me real satisfaction to be of service to your mother there.
Meg put out her hand with a face full of gratitude. How kind you all are! Mother will accept, I'm sure, and it will be such a relief to know that she has someone to take care of her. Thank you very, very much, she exclaimed, looking into his deep brown eyes. Everything was arranged by the time Laurie returned with a note from Aunt March, enclosing the desired amount and a short message. In the note, she repeated what she had often said before, that she had always told them it was foolish for March to go into the army, had known that no good would come of it, and hoped they would take her advice next time. Mrs. March put the note in the fire, the money in her purse, and went on with her preparations. The short afternoon went by quickly. Meg and her mother were busy packing, while Beth and Amy got tea, and Hannah finished her ironing, but still Joe did not come. They began to get anxious, and Laurie went off to find her, for no one ever knew what Joe might be doing. He missed her, however, and she came walking in with a strange look of fun and fear, satisfaction and regret. She laid a roll of bills before her mother, saying,
"That's my contribution toward making Father comfortable and bringing him home." "My dear, where did you get it? $25? "Don't worry, Marmee. It's mine, honestly. I didn't beg, borrow, or steal it. I earned it, and I don't think you'll blame me, for I only sold what was my own."
As she spoke, Joe took off her hat, and the family was shocked to see her long hair cut short.
"Your hair! Your beautiful hair! Oh, Joe, how could you? You're one beauty."
"My dear girl, there was no need for this."
She doesn't look like my Joe anymore, but I love her dearly for it.
As everyone exclaimed, Joe looked indifferent, though they all knew what a great sacrifice she had made.
"It doesn't change the fate of the nation, so don't cry, Beth. I was getting too proud of my hair anyway. It will do my brains good to have that hair taken off. My head feels wonderfully cool and light. I'm satisfied, so please take the money and let's have dinner." "Tell me all about it, Joe. I am not quite satisfied, but I can't blame you, for I know how willingly you sacrificed as you did. But, my dear, it was not necessary, and I'm afraid you will regret it one of these days,"
said Mrs. March.
"No, I won't,"
returned Joe.
"Why did you do it?"
asked Amy, still in shock.
"Well, I was hoping to do something for Father,"
replied Joe, as they gathered around the table.
"I hate to borrow as much as Mother does, and I knew Aunt March would be angry if I asked. May gave all her salary last month toward the rent, and I only got some clothes with mine, so I felt terrible and hoped to make some money for Father." "You shouldn't feel terrible, my child. You had no winter things and got the simplest with your own earnings,"
said Mrs. March.
"I didn't plan to sell my hair at first, but as I went along, I kept thinking what I could do when I walked by a barber's shop. I noticed wigs for sale made of women's hair. Some were nearly $40. It came to me all of a sudden that I had one thing to make money out of, and without stopping to think, I walked in, asked if they bought hair, and what they would give for mine. He rather stared at first, as if he wasn't used to having girls come into his shop asking him to buy their hair. He said he didn't care about mine. It wasn't the fashionable color, and he never paid much for the hair. It was getting late, and you know when I start to do something, I hate to give it up. So I begged him to take it, and told him why I was in such a hurry."
"Didn't you feel terrible when the first cut came?" asked Meg.
"I took a last look at my hair while the man got his things, and that was the end of it. I will admit, though, I felt a bit odd when I saw the dear old hair laid out on the table, and felt only the short, rough ends of my head. It almost seemed as if I'd had an arm or a leg cut off." "Thank you, dear,"
said her mother quietly. The girls then changed the subject and talked as cheerfully as they could about Mr. Brooks' kindness, the prospect of a fine day tomorrow, and the happy times they would have when Father returned. No one wanted to go to bed when, at 10 o'clock, Mrs. March called the girls to the piano to sing before going to bed.
"Now, go to bed and don't talk, for we must be up early and shall need all the sleep we can get. Good night, my darlings,"
said Mrs. March. They kissed her quietly and went to bed in silence. Beth and Amy soon fell asleep, but Meg lay awake, thinking the most serious thoughts she had ever known in her short life. Joe was motionless, and her sister believed she was asleep till she heard quiet weeping. Joe, dear, what is it? Are you crying about Father?
No, not now.
What then?
My hair. I'm not sorry, though. I'd do it again tomorrow if I could, but I suppose I'm just being selfish. Don't tell anyone. It's all over now. I thought you were asleep. Why are you still awake?
I can't sleep. I'm so anxious, said Meg.
Think about something pleasant, and you'll soon be asleep.
I tried it, but I still can't sleep.
What were you thinking of?
Handsome faces, eyes in particular, answered Meg, smiling to herself in the dark.
What color do you like best?
Brown. Sometimes. Blue are lovely. Joe laughed, and Meg told her to go to sleep, dreaming of living in her castle in the air. At midnight the rooms were quiet, and their mother went from bed to bed, kissing each girl on the forehead, saying,
Be comforted, dear soul. There is always light behind the clouds.
Chapter 14. Letters. In the cold gray morning, the sisters prepared for their mother's departure, and knowing that a real trouble had come, they turned to each other for support. They agreed to say goodbye cheerfully and hopefully, and send their mother on her anxious journey without crying or complaints. Everything seemed very strange when they went down to breakfast at such an early hour. Even Hannah's familiar face looked unnatural as she flew about her kitchen preparing. The bags were packed, and their mother sat at the table trying to eat, but looked rather pale and worn with sleeplessness and anxiety. Meg's eyes kept filling with tears. Joe was forced to hide her face, and the little girls had troubled expressions. Nobody talked much, but as the time drew near, Mrs. March said to the girls,
Children, don't worry while I am gone, or think that you can comfort yourselves by doing nothing and trying to forget. Go on with your work as usual, for work will help. Hope and keep busy, and whatever happens, remember that you never can be fatherless.
Yes, Mother.
Meg, dear, watch over your sisters and talk to Hannah or Mr. Lawrence if you are worried. Be patient, Joe. Don't get upset easily. Write to me often. And be my brave girl, ready to help and cheer us all. Beth, comfort yourself with your music and be faithful to the little home duties. And you, Amy, help all you can. Be obedient and be safe.
We will, Mother. We will.
Goodbye, my darlings,
she whispered as she left, kissing each dear face before hurrying into the carriage. As the carriage went away, she looked back to see her 4 girls smiling and waving, and behind them, old Mr. Lawrence, faithful Hannah, and faithful Laurie.
How kind everyone is to us,
she said as she turned around.
I don't see how they couldn't,
returned Mr. Brooke, smiling. And so the long journey began happily, with smiles and cheerful words. It seems as if half the house is gone, said Meg, after the girls had returned to the house. Beth opened her lips to say something, but could only point to the clothes that Mother had mended, showing that even in her last hurried moments, she had thought and worked for them. It was a little thing, but they all cried bitterly over it. Now, my dear young ladies, said Hannah, after the girls had finished crying, remember what your mother said, and don't worry. We must all work hard for when your mother and father return.
Hope and keep busy,
said Jo to herself.
I shall go to Aunt March's, though I know she'll lecture.
I shall go to the King's, though I'd much rather stay home and attend to things here, said Meg.
No need of that. Beth and I can keep the house perfectly well,
Amy explained proudly. Hannah will tell us what to do, and we'll have everything nice when you come home, added Beth. When Meg and Jo left, they looked back sadly at the window, where they were used to seeing their mother's face smiling at them. It was gone, but Beth had remembered, and there she was, smiling and waving.
"That's so like my Beth,"
said Joe cheerfully.
"Goodbye, Meg. Don't worry about Father, dear," she added.
"And I hope Aunt March won't complain. Your hair is wonderful, and it looks very boyish and nice," returned Meg. News from their father comforted the girls very much, as, though dangerously ill, the presence of his tender wife helped him greatly. Faithful Mr. Brooke sent a note every day, and as head of the family, Meg insisted on reading the notes, which became more cheerful as the week passed, and the girls were all eager to write as well. Chapter 15. Little Faithful. For a week, the girls all worked tirelessly. Relieved of their first anxiety about their father, the girls soon relaxed their efforts a little. They did not forget their duties, but hoping and keeping busy seemed to grow easier, and after such great work, they felt they deserved a holiday. Joe caught a bad cold through not wearing a hat outside and was ordered to stay at home till she was better, as Aunt March didn't like to hear people read with colds. Joe liked this and remained on the family sofa reading. Amy discovered that housework and art did not go well together. Meg went daily to care for the King children and sewed, or thought she did, at home, but much time was spent in writing long letters to her mother. Beth continued with her duties, though sometimes finding it very difficult. All the little duties were faithfully done each day, and many of her sisters also, for they were forgetful. When she became upset about missing her mother or fearing for her father, she went away to a certain closet in her mother's room, crying silently to herself.
"Meg, I wish you'd go to see the Hummels. You know Mother told us not to forget them,"
said Beth, 10 days after Mrs. March's departure. After last Christmas, Mrs. March continued to visit the sick woman, Mrs. Hummel, and her children, offering support, and while she was in Washington, the girls had promised to continue the visits. "I'm too tired to go this afternoon," replied Meg. "Can't you, Joe?" asked Beth.
"Too cold out with my cold."
"I thought you were almost well."
"I am almost well, but not healthy enough to go to the Hummels,"
said Joe, laughing. "Why don't you go yourself?" asked Meg.
"I have gone every day, but the baby is sick, and I don't know what to do for it. Mrs. Hummel goes away to work, and the young children take care of it, but it keeps getting sicker and sicker, and I think you or Hannah should go."
"Amy will be in soon, so perhaps she will go," suggested Meg. Beth went to do some cleaning, and soon the Hummels were forgotten. An hour passed, and Amy still had not come, and the others were resting. Beth then quietly put on her coat and went out to see the Hummels. It was late when she came back, and no one saw her go upstairs to her mother's closet. Half an hour after, Joe went there for something, and there found Beth, looking rather ill.
"My dear, what's the matter?"
cried Joe.
"You've had scarlet fever, haven't you?"
"Yes, I had it years ago when Meg did. Why?"
"Then I'll tell you. Oh, Joe, the baby's dead."
"What baby?"
"Mrs. Hummel's. It died in my arms before she got home,"
cried Beth.
"My poor dear, how terrible for you. I should have gone,"
said Joe.
"It wasn't terrible, Joe, only sad. I just sat and held it softly till Mrs. Hummel came with the doctor. He said it had died of scarlet fever. When the doctor came, he told me to go home right away, or I'd get the fever."
"No, you won't. Oh, Beth, if you get sick, I could never forgive myself,"
she exclaimed.
"Now, Beth,"
she said gently,
"you've been over to see the baby every day for more than a week, so I'm afraid you are going to have scarlet fever, but I'll call Hannah. She knows all about sickness."
"Don't let Amy come. She never had it," said Beth anxiously.
"We'll send Amy to Aunt March's. It'll be all right, my dear."
Hannah took charge immediately, telling Joe there was no need to worry. The doctor was called, and Amy was immediately sent to Aunt March's, though she was quite upset at having to leave, but agreed after Laurie promised to visit her every day at Aunt March's.
"How is the little dear?"
asked Laurie anxiously, after persuading Amy to go to Aunt March's. "She is lying down on Mother's bed and feels better. The baby's death troubled her," said Meg.
"Well, shall I send your mother a telegram to explain?"
he asked. "That is what troubles me," said Meg. "I think we should tell her if Beth is really ill, but Hannah says we shouldn't worry her, as Mother can't leave Father, and knowing Beth is sick will only upset her." The doctor came, said Beth had the fever, but thought she would recover very soon, though he looked quite troubled after hearing the Hummel story. Chapter 16. Dark Days. Beth did have the fever, and was much sicker than anyone but Hannah and the doctor suspected. The girls knew nothing about illness, and Mr. Lawrence was not allowed to see her, so Hannah was in charge. Meg stayed home, as she feared she might give the King's children the illness, feeling guilty for writing letters to her mother with no mention of her sister's terrible illness. She did not think it right not to tell her mother, but Hannah refused to allow the girls to worry their mother, as Beth was very patient. But there came a time when, during the fever, she looked more sick than usual. Then Joe grew frightened, and Meg begged to be allowed to write the truth. How dark the days seemed now, how sad and lonely the house, and how anxious were the sisters as they worked and waited. During this time, Margaret realized how rich she had been in things more precious than riches, in love, protection, peace, and health. Then it was Joe, living in the darkened room with her younger sister, who learned to see the beauty and sweetness of Beth's nature, and promised to follow her unselfish ways. And Amy, alone at Aunt March's, longed eagerly to be at home, that she might work for Beth, feeling now that no service would be too difficult, and remembering how many duties she had forgotten, only to have Beth unselfishly finish them. In the meantime, Mr. Lawrence locked the grand piano, because he could not bear to be reminded of the young neighbor who used to make the evenings so pleasant for him. Everyone missed Beth. The milkman, baker, and storekeeper all asked about her. Poor Mrs. Hummel came to apologize for her thoughtlessness. The neighbors all sent comforts and good wishes, and even those who knew her best were surprised to find how many friends shy little Beth had made. On the 1st of December, the doctor came, looked at Beth with a worried expression, and said to Hannah,
"If Mrs. March can leave her husband, she'd better come soon."
Soon after, Laurie came in with a letter from their mother, explaining that their father was improving a great deal. Joe read it thankfully, but looked full of misery, and Laurie asked quickly,
"What is it? Is Beth worse?"
"I've sent for Mother. The doctor told us to,"
she said.
"Oh, Joe, it's not so bad as that,"
cried Laurie.
"Yes, it is. She doesn't know us, and can't even speak any longer."
"I'm here. Hold on to me, Joe, dear,"
whispered Laurie as he put his arms around her. "I'm so glad Father is better. Now she won't feel so bad about leaving him. Oh, my dear Beth, I don't know what I would do without my dear little Beth."
I don't think she will die. And besides, I know your mother will be coming soon to care for her as only a mother can. Let me tell you something that will help. I sent your mother a telegram yesterday, and Brooke answered she'd come immediately, and she'll be here tonight, and everything will be all right. Aren't you glad I did it?"
"Oh, Laurie, oh, Mother, I am so glad,"
she exclaimed.
"You see, I got worried, and so did Grandpa. We thought Hannah was not being wise, and thought your mother should know. She'd never forgive us if if anything happened. So your mother will come by 2 in the morning. I shall go to the train station for her, and you've only got to keep Beth quiet till your mother arrives."
The girls never forgot that night, as they waited anxiously for their mother to arrive. They waited, and shortly after 2 in the morning, the doctor arrived to see Beth, and joyously explained that Beth was improving. Meg and Joe went quietly into the hall, sitting on the stairs and holding each other close. Soon enough they heard the carriage arrive, and were overjoyed to see their mother walk into the house. Chapter 17. Amy's Will. While these things were happening at home, Amy was having a hard time at Aunt March's. She felt, for the first time in her life, how much she had been loved and cared for at home. Aunt March never gave her many words of encouragement, but she did try to be kind, for the well-behaved little girl pleased her very much. She really did her best to make Amy happy, but what terrible mistakes she made. Amy was quite worried with all the rules and orders, as well as the aunt's many long talks. Amy had to wash the cups every morning, and clean the spoons, the teapot, and glasses. She then must dust the room, then Aunt March's bird must be fed, the dog combed, and 10 trips a day upstairs to get things for Mrs. March. After the tiresome work, she must do her lessons. Then she was allowed 1 hour of exercise or play. Laurie came every day to visit the little girl, and after dinner, she had to read aloud and sit still while the old lady slept, which she usually did for an hour. The evenings were the worst of all, for Aunt March told long stories about her youth. These stories were so dull that when the old lady was finished, Amy was always ready to go to bed, intending to cry all night, but usually went to sleep before one tear filled her eye. During her time at Aunt March's, Amy became dear friends with Esther, Aunt March's French servant, who had lived with Aunt March for several years. Esther was Aunt March's dearest friend, and told Amy some quite amusing stories about the old lady. Often she allowed Amy to look at the old lady's jewelry, and to examine and arrange these things gave Amy great satisfaction.
"I wish I knew where all these pretty things would go when Aunt March dies,"
Amy said one day, looking over the jewelry. "To you and your sisters, I know it. Mrs. March has told me. I was present when she wrote her will, explaining where all her things would go if she dies."
"How nice, but I wish she'd let us have them now,"
observed Amy. "It is too soon for the young ladies to wear these things. I believe Mrs. March will give you the green ring you love so much when you return home, as she approves of your good behavior and charming manners."
"Do you think so? Oh, I'll behave so well if I can only have that lovely ring. I do like Aunt March after all."
From that day on, she was more obedient than ever, and the old lady was quite pleased. Esther spent a great deal of time with the little girl and saw how upset she was at not being near her family, and so she offered to help Amy to build a little chapel in her closet, where Amy could go to pray and think about her family. Esther was sincere in the advice she gave to the girl, as she was quite fond of her and felt a great deal of anxiety for the sisters. The little girl was very sincere in all this, for being left alone away from home was quite difficult. She tried to forget her miseries, keep cheerful, and be satisfied with doing right, though no one praised her for it. In her effort to be very, very good, she decided to make her own will, as Aunt March had done, so that if she became ill and died, her things would be remembered. She wrote out the important document, with some help from Esther, and Amy felt relieved, eager to show Laurie later that afternoon. When he arrived, she happily showed him the will, which he found quite amusing, though he could not laugh for fear of offending the little girl. She explained, and then anxiously asked, "What about Beth? How is she?"
Well, my dear, she's doing much better, now that your mother has returned, though one day she was quite ill and told Joe she wanted to give her piano to Meg, her cats to you, and the poor old doll to Joe. She was sorry she had so little to give, and left pieces of her hair for the rest of us, and her best love to Grandpa. She never thought of a will.
Is there really any danger about Beth?
asked Amy. Her eyes filled with tears.
I'm afraid there is, but we must hope for the best, so don't cry, dear.
And Laurie put his arm around her, which was very comforting. When he had gone, she went to her little chapel and prayed for Beth, with tears running down her cheeks, feeling that 1,000,000 green rings would not be enough to replace her gentle sister. Chapter 18. More Secrets. The meeting between mother and daughters was truly joyous, and the two older girls waited on their mother, as she would not let go of little Beth's hand, even as she slept. While Meg and Joe fed their mother, they listened to her whisper about their father's health, Mr. Brooks's promise to stay with him, the train's delay during the storm, and the comfort of Laurie's hopeful face when she arrived. What a strange yet pleasant day that was. Everyone slept that night, feeling safe with their mother returned. Mrs. March would not leave Beth's side, but rested in the big chair, waking often to look at, touch, and worry over her child. Laurie, in the meantime, went off to comfort Amy till her mother could go for a visit. Later that day, however, she was delighted to see her mother walking in the door. Amy showed her mother the little chapel, who was quite pleased to see such changes in her daughter.
I like it very much, dear. It is an excellent plan to have some place where we can go to be quiet when things upset us. There are many hard times in this life of ours, but we can always bear them if we have help. Yes, Mother, and when I go home, I plan to make a chapel in my closet.
As her mother held Amy's little hands, she noticed a large green ring on her finger. She said nothing, but Amy understood the look, and after a minute's pause said,
I wanted to speak to you about this, but I forgot. Aunt gave me the ring today. She called me to her and kissed me, and put it on my finger, saying she would like to keep me always. I'd like to wear it, Mother. Can I? The ring is very pretty, but I think you're rather too young for such things, Amy,
said Mrs. March.
I don't think I like the ring just because it's so pretty, but I want to wear it to remind me not to be selfish. I've thought a great deal lately about how naughty I've been. Beth isn't selfish, and that's the reason everyone loves her and feels so bad at the thought of losing her. People wouldn't feel half as bad about me if I was sick, and I don't deserve to have them, but I'd like to be loved and missed by many friends, so I'm going to try to be like Beth. I'm sure I'll forget this promise to myself sometimes, but if I had something always to remind me, I guess I would do better. May I try this way? Yes, but I have more faith in your closet chapel. Wear your ring, dear, and do your best. Now, I must go back. Continue to think of your sister, and we will soon have you home again.
That evening, while Meg was writing to her father, Jo went quietly upstairs into Beth's room to find her mother in her usual place on the chair next to the bed. Jo stood for a moment in the doorway, looking worried.
What is it, dear?
Asked Mrs. March, holding out her hand.
I want to tell you something, Mother. About Meg? How quickly you guessed. Yes, it's about her, and though it's a little thing, it bothers me. Beth is asleep, so speak in a whisper and tell me. Last summer, Meg left a pair of gloves over at the Lawrences, and only one was returned. We forgot all about it, till Laurie told me that Mr. Brooke had it. He kept it with him, and once it fell out, and Laurie joked with him about it, and Mr. Brooke admitted that he liked Meg, but she was so young, and he so poor. Now isn't that terrible? Do you think Meg cares for him?
Asked Mrs. March with an anxious look.
Dear me, I don't know anything about love and such foolishness,
cried Jo.
Oh dear! You're going to let Meg marry him after he went to take care of Father just to make you like him? My dear, don't get angry about it, and I will tell you how it happened. John, Mr. Brooke, went with me at Mr. Lawrence's request, and has faithfully cared for poor Father since we arrived. He was perfectly open and honorable about Meg, for he told us he loved her, but would earn a comfortable home before he asked her to marry him. He only wanted our permission to love her and work for her, and the right to make her love him if he could. He is a truly excellent young man, and we could not refuse to listen to him. But I will not consent to Meg agreeing to marry so young. Of course not. It would be quite foolish. I knew something was going on, and now it's worse than I thought. I just wish I could marry Meg myself and keep her safe in the family.
This idea made Mrs. March smile, but she said,
Jo, you mustn't say anything to Meg yet. When John comes back and I see them together, I will better understand her feelings toward him. She'll see those handsome eyes she always talks about, and then it will be her decision. She read the notes he sent more than she did your letters, and likes brown eyes, and doesn't think John an ugly name, and she'll go and fall in love and leave us. Jo, it is natural and right for you all to go to homes of your own in time, but I do want to keep my girls as long as I can. I am sorry that this happened so soon, for Meg is only 17, and it will be some years before John can make a home for her. Your father and I have agreed that she will not marry before 20. If she and John love one another, they can wait. I hope things will go happily with her. Wouldn't you rather she marry a rich man?
Asked Jo.
Money is a good and useful thing, Jo, and I hope my girls will never need it too terribly, nor be tempted by too much. I would like to see John in some good business to earn an income to keep Meg comfortable, but there is no need for a great fortune. I understand, Mother, and quite agree, but I'm disappointed about Meg, for I had planned to have her marry Laurie, so she could live a life of great wealth. Wouldn't it be nice?
Asked Jo.
He is younger than she, you know,
began Mrs. March.
Only a little,
interrupted Jo.
He behaves older than his age. Also, he's rich and generous, and loves us all. I think it's quite a pity that my plan will be ruined. I'm afraid Laurie is still not grown up enough for Meg, and still too young to depend on. Don't make plans, Jo. but let time and their own feelings bring your friends together. Well, I wish I could keep us from growing up. What a pity.
What is a pity? Asked Meg, coming into the room with a letter in her hand.
Oh, something silly. Now I'm going to bed. Good night,
said Joe.
What a lovely letter. Please add that I send my love to John,
said Mrs. March, looking over Meg's letter. Do you call him John? Asked Meg, smiling.
Yes, he has been like a son to us, and we are very fond of him,
replied Mrs. March, smiling back at her daughter. I'm glad of that. He is so lonely. Good night, Mother dear. It is such a wonderful comfort to have you here, was Meg's answer. Her mother kissed her tenderly, and as she went away, Mrs. March said to herself,
She does not love John yet, but will soon learn to.
Chapter 19. Laurie's Letter. Joe's face looked quite mysterious the next day, as she felt quite important with the great secret her mother had told her. Meg noticed, but did not trouble herself to ask any questions, as she had learned that the best way to manage Joe was not to ask any questions, which would greatly surprise Joe and force her to tell everything. Meg was rather shocked, therefore, when the silence continued. Laurie, too, noticed the change in Joe and decided that he would discover the secret. He begged, teased, threatened, and scolded, but she refused to tell. Finally, he decided that it must concern Meg and Mr. Brooke. Meg, in the meantime, had forgotten the matter and was preparing for her father's return. But all of a sudden a change came over her, and for a day or two she acted quite strangely, looking embarrassed when spoken to, and was often found looking troubled.
She's in love. She's leaving us very fast. Once she said, John, as you do, and then looked embarrassed. Whatever shall we do?
Said Joe to her mother one day.
Nothing but wait. Let her alone. Be kind and patient. And when father comes, we'll settle everything, replied her mother. Here's a note to you, Meg. How strange, said Joe next day. Mrs. March and Joe were busy with their own affairs when Meg cried out, staring at her note with a frightened face. What is the matter? Cried her mother, running to her. It's all a mistake. He didn't send it. Oh, Joe, how could you? Meg asked. Me? I've done nothing. What's she talking about? Cried Joe in confession. Meg's eyes had a look of anger in them as she threw the note at Joe, saying, You wrote it, and that bad boy helped you. How could you be so rude to us both? Joe heard little of what she said, as she and her mother were reading the mysterious note, written in a strange handwriting. My dearest Margaret, I can no longer be silent about my love for you. I cannot tell your parents, but I believe they would agree if they knew we loved one another. Mr. Lawrence will help me find excellent work, and then, my sweet girl, you will make me happy. Please say nothing to your family yet, but send me your response through Laurie. I must know if you love me as I do you. Your loving John. Oh, that evil boy! I'll certainly scold him for this, cried Joe, but her mother stopped her, saying, Stop, Joe. You have played many jokes before, and I am afraid you were a part of this. Oh, Mother, I haven't. I never saw that note before, and don't know anything about it, said Joe honestly. If I had taken part in it, I'd have done it better than this. Mr. Brooke wouldn't write such things, she added angrily. It's like his writing,
said Meg, coming in with the note in her hand.
"Oh, Meg, you didn't answer the letter, did you?"
cried Mrs. March quickly. "Yes, I did."
"Here's a terrible problem. I'll go fetch that terrible boy to explain,"
said Joe, walking toward the door.
"Hush. Joe, you stop. Now, Meg, tell me what happened,"
said her mother, sitting down next to Meg, refusing to allow Joe to leave. "I received the first letter from Laurie, who didn't look as if he knew anything about it," began Meg. "I was worried at first and wished to tell you, but then remembered how you liked Mr. Brooke, so I thought you wouldn't mind if I kept my little secret for a few days. I'm so foolish to have done such a thing."
"What did you say to him?"
asked Mrs. March. "I only said I was too young to do anything about it yet, that I didn't wish to have secrets from you, and he must speak to Father. I was very grateful for his kindness, and would be his friend, but nothing more for a long while." Mrs. March smiled, well pleased at her daughter's response.
"How did he respond to that, my dear?"
"He wrote in a different way, telling me that he never sent any love letter at all, and is very sorry that my sister Jo played such a terrible joke on us both. It's very kind and respectful, but how terrible I feel."
"I don't believe Brooke ever saw either of these letters,"
said Jo, examining the two letters.
"Laurie wrote them both and keeps yours to tease me because I won't tell him my secret."
"Don't have any secrets, Jo. Tell it to Mother and keep out of trouble, as I should have done," said Meg.
"My dear, it was Mother that told me." "Now, Jo, I'll comfort Meg while you go get Laurie,"
said Mrs. March calmly. Jo went away quickly, and Mrs. March gently told Meg Mr. Brooke's real feelings.
"Now, dear, what are your own? Do you love him enough to wait till he can make a home for you, or will you keep yourself free for the present?"
"I've been so scared and worried. I don't want to have anything to do with lovers for a long while, perhaps never," answered Meg. "If John doesn't know anything about this, don't tell him, and make Jo and Laurie keep quiet. I feel so shameful." Soon enough, Laurie arrived, and he was left alone with Mrs. March. For half an hour, the two spoke quietly in the sitting room, but what happened during that time, the girls never knew. When the girls were called in, Laurie was standing by their mother with a guilty face, and Jo forgave him instantly. Meg received a sincere apology and was much comforted when told that Brooke knew nothing of the joke.
"I'll never tell him, so I hope you'll forgive me, Meg, and I'll do anything to show how terribly sorry I am,"
he added, looking very much ashamed of himself. "I'll try, but it was a terrible thing to do. I didn't think you could do such a thing, Laurie," replied Meg, trying to hide her confusion.
"It was horrible, and I don't deserve to be spoken to for a month. But you will, though, won't you?"
he asked with a smile, and Meg could only laugh. Everyone else had forgotten the event, except Meg. She never spoke of a certain person, but she thought of him a good deal, dreamed dreams more than ever, and once Jo found a bit of paper with the words, "Mrs. John Brooke," and was horrified to see such a thing, immediately throwing the paper in the fire. Chapter 20. Pleasant Times. The weeks that followed were peaceful. Beth improved rapidly, and Mr. March began to talk of returning early in the new year. Beth was soon able to lie on the sofa all day, amusing herself with her beloved cats. Jo carried her in her strong arms out every day for a short walk near the house. Meg cheerfully burned and blackened her white hands cooking for little Beth, while Amy celebrated her return by giving away as many of her treasured things as she could force her sisters to accept. As Christmas approached, Hannah declared that it was going to be an unusually fine day, and she proved herself to be right. To begin with, Mr. March wrote that he should soon be with them. Then Beth felt surprisingly well that morning, well enough to stand in front of the window to watch Joe and Laurie build a fantastic snowman in the yard, singing as she watched with delight. How Beth laughed when she saw it. "I'm so full of happiness that if Father was only here, I couldn't be happier," said Beth quietly.
"So am I,"
added Joe.
"I'm sure I am,"
cried Amy. "Of course I am," cried Meg.
"How can I not be?"
said Mrs. March gratefully as her eyes went from her husband's letter to Beth's smiling face. Half an hour after everyone had said they were so happy, they received a gift to complete their happiness. Laurie opened the sitting room door and walked in quietly, with a look of excitement on his face, saying,
"Here's another Christmas present for the March family."
Before he finished speaking, a tall man appeared in the arms of another tall man who tried to say something. For the next several minutes, everybody gathered around Mr. March joyously. Mr. Brooke kissed Meg entirely by mistake, while Amy fell over a chair, and Joe nearly fainted away with excitement. Mrs. March soon spoke with a warning.
"Hush! Remember Beth."
But it was too late. The study door flew open, and the little girl appeared. Joy put strength into her weak body, and Beth ran straight into her father's arms. Soon enough, the party sat down to eat. Mr. March told them how he had longed to surprise them, and how, when the warm weather came, his doctor had allowed him to return home. He explained how Brooke had faithfully helped him, and was certain he was an honest, trustworthy young man. There was never such a Christmas dinner as they had that day. Mr. Lawrence and his grandson dined with them, also Mr. Brooke, at whom Joe gave angry looks, which greatly amused Laurie. Soon after the dinner, the guests left, and the girls remained gathered around their father.
"Just a year ago, we were complaining over the sad Christmas we expected to have. Do you remember?"
asked Joe. "Rather a pleasant year we have had," said Meg cheerfully.
"I think it's been a pretty hard one,"
observed Amy.
"I'm glad it's over because we've got you back," whispered Beth.
"You have had a difficult year, my dears, especially the end of it, but you have bravely done your duties,"
said Mr. March.
"How do you know? Did Mother tell you?"
asked Joe.
"Not much, but I've made several discoveries today."
"Oh, tell us what they are," cried Meg.
"Here is one."
And taking up her hands, Mr. March pointed to the rough fingers and burn spots.
"I remember a time when this hand was white and smooth, and your first care was to keep it that way. It was very pretty then, but to me it is much prettier now, for it shows what work you have done for this family. Meg, my dear, I value the womanly skill that keeps this home happy more than white hands. I'm proud to shake this good little hand, and hope I shall not soon have to give it away to a husband."
Meg was grateful for such kind words and approving smile.
"What about Joe? She has been very, very good to me," said Beth.
"Although she now has a rather boyish haircut, I don't see the son Joe I left a year ago,"
said Mr. March.
"I see a young lady with proper manners and a more gentle voice. She now moves quietly and takes care of a certain little person in a motherly way that delights me. And I know that I couldn't find anything beautiful enough to be bought with the $25 my good girl sent me."
Jo looked at her father with a sweet look at hearing such praise, feeling that she did deserve some of it.
"Now, Beth,"
said Amy, longing for her turn, but ready to wait.
"My little Beth is not as shy as she used to be,"
began their father cheerfully, but remembering how close to death she once was, held her close, saying tenderly,
"I've got you safe, my Beth, and I'll keep you so."
After a minute's silence, he looked down at Amy, who sat near his feet, saying,
"I observed that Amy took care of many duties for her mother today, gave Meg her seat tonight, and has waited on everyone with patience. I also see that she does not worry as she used to, and has not even mentioned a very pretty ring that she wears. So I must conclude that she has learned to think of other people more and of herself less. I am glad of this, for though I am very proud of my graceful girl, I am all the more proud of a lovable daughter with a talent for making life beautiful to herself and others."
Chapter 21. Aunt March Settles the Question. The girls and their mother remained gathered around Mr. March the next day, leaving their duties to be done later. Nothing seemed needed to complete their happiness, but something was needed. Mr. and Mrs. March looked at one another with an anxious expression as they watched Meg carefully. Jo was seen giving Brooks's umbrella, which was left in the hall, angry looks. Meg was shy and became quite embarrassed when John's name was mentioned. Amy said,
"Everyone seems to be waiting for something."
And Beth wondered why the neighbors didn't run over as usual. One afternoon, as Mr. Brooke came in for a visit, he found Meg alone in the sitting room.
"Good afternoon. How is your father?"
he asked, looking a bit confused. "He's quite well. I'll get him and tell him you're here," said Meg, standing up nervously.
"Don't go. Are you afraid of me, Margaret?"
he asked, looking quite hurt. "How can I be afraid of you when you have been so kind to Father? I only wish I could thank you for it."
"Meg, I care about you deeply, and only want to know if you care for me a little. I love you so much, dear,"
explained Mr. Brooke tenderly. I'm too young," said Meg after a moment of silence.
"I'll wait, and in the meantime, you could be learning to like me, couldn't you, dear?"
"Oh, please, go away and let me be," exclaimed Meg, feeling quite confused and frightened. Poor Mr. Brooke looked as if his lovely castle in the air was being destroyed, as he had never seen Meg speak with such anger before.
"Do you really mean that?"
he asked anxiously, following her as she walked away. "Yes, I do. I don't want to be worried about such things right now."
"May I hope you'll change your mind? I'll wait and say nothing till you have had more time,"
he said sadly as he walked toward the door. At that moment, Aunt March walked into the room. The old lady couldn't resist coming to see Mr. March. She had walked through the house quietly, hoping to surprise them. She did surprise two of them, and Mr. Brooke quickly went into the next room. "Well, what is this?" cried the old lady. "Oh, this is Father's friend. I'm so surprised to see you," said Meg in confusion. "Oh, no, that's the boy's tutor. Is it true? I understand now. You haven't agreed to marry him, have you?" cried Aunt March. "Hush! He'll hear." "Now, I have something to tell you. Now, you tell me quickly. Do you plan to marry this young man? If you do, not 1 penny of my great fortune will be given to you. Remember that, and don't be foolish. said the old lady. I shall marry whom I please, Aunt March, and you can leave your money to anyone you like, she said bravely. Well, you'll soon regret that, exclaimed Aunt March. No, I won't. Father and Mother like John, though he is poor. John is good and wise, with a great deal of talent, and he's willing to work. Everyone likes and respects him, and I'm proud to think he cares for me, though I'm so poor and young and silly, said Meg, looking prettier than ever in her sincerity. He knows you have rich relatives, child. That's the secret of his liking, I suspect. Aunt March, what a terrible thing to say! I won't listen to you a minute longer if you talk that way. My John wouldn't marry for money any more than I would. We are willing to work, and we plan to wait. I'm not afraid of being poor, as I've been happy so far, and I know I shall be with him because he loves me, and I... Meg stopped, remembering that she hadn't made a decision yet. Aunt March was very angry, as she had planned to find a rich husband for the pretty young girl. Well, I'm finished with helping you, then. I'm disappointed in you, and don't have the will to see your father now. Don't expect anything from me when you are married. Your Mr. Brooks' friends must take care of you. I'm done with you forever, she said as she went out of the front door quickly. As Meg sat down, she was shocked to hear Mr. Brooks's voice saying,
Thank you for defending me, and Aunt March for proving that you do care for me a little bit.
I didn't know how much when you had asked me, began Meg.
And I don't need to go away, but may stay and be happy, dear?
Yes, John, she said, hiding her face as he went to sit next to her. Joe was astonished to see the two together when she walked into the room a moment later, seeing the two lovers sitting and laughing together.
Sister Joe, congratulate us,
exclaimed Mr. Brooke, after seeing her expression. Mr. and Mrs. March soon walked into the room, looking silently delighted. The little girls, as well, considered it a most agreeable and interesting event.
I hope the 3rd year from now will end well with a wedding. Shall work now to work out my plans,
said Mr. Brooke, smiling at Meg, as if everything had become possible to him now.
Doesn't it seem like a very long time to wait?
asked Amy, who was in a hurry for the wedding. I've got so much to learn before I shall be ready. It seems a rather short time to me, answered Meg.
You have only to wait. I am to do the work,
said John.
I don't approve of the matter, but I've made up my mind to bear it, and shall not say a word against it,
said Joe sincerely.
You can't know how hard it is for me to give up Meg, she continued.
Well now, don't be upset,
said Laurie cheerfully.
Meg is happy. Brooke will get settled. Grandpa will help him, and it will be wonderful to see Meg in her own little house. We'll have excellent times after she is gone, as I shall be finished with college by that time, and we'll go abroad on a nice trip. Would that help you?
I think it would, but no one knows what will happen in 3 years,
said Joe thoughtfully.